Close your eyes and take a deep breath. Today I invite you into a story that begins with a moment of madness and ends with immortality. A legend etched not just in stone, but in the very stars that bear his name. This is not merely the tale of a powerful hero. It is the brutal chronicle of a life defined by atonement, the journey of a man cursed by the gods, but blessed with the strength to challenge fate itself. In this epic, a disgraced champion is forced into servitude, condemned to conquer every beast born of nightmare, from the invincible Nemean Lion to the venomous Lernaean Hydra. He faces tyrannical kings, navigates the treacherous will of a vengeful queen, carries the very weight of the sky, and descends into the eternal darkness of the underworld to bargain with Hades. He is the man whose suffering forged the greatest strength, the one who walked through ruin to give birth to a legacy that would echo across millennia. If a story is to be told that reveals how extreme loss can transform into eternal legend and how a mortal can rise to sit among the Olympians, it must be the story of the one who paid his penance to earn his power, Heracles, the son of Zeus, the champion of Olympus. Disclaimer: the visuals in this video were created using artificial intelligence. There are no bloody or excessively graphic scenes. However, some moments have been designed for cinematic and emotional depth, particularly depicting the struggles with mythological creatures. If you are sensitive to such imagery, please consider this before watching. If you wish to join me on these legendary journeys, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, turn on the notification bell, and leave a comment telling me which epic you'd like to explore next. I look forward to traveling through these timeless stories with you. Take another deep breath, relax your mind, and let the Mediterranean winds guide you. Wishing you a peaceful sleep. The epic begins now. Even the leaves on the trees seem to have forgotten how to breathe under the weight of that sin. Our story begins not with the sound of thunder, but with the silent scream of a hero's shattered soul. That hero was none other than Heracles, the shadow of great Zeus on earth, the greatest hope and the deepest tragedy of humanity. For the poisonous breath of the goddess, Hera had seeped into his veins, cloaked his mind in a fog, and driven him to kill his loved ones, his beloved wife, Megara, and his own children, the other half of his soul, with his own hands in an unconscious moment of terror. After this horrific act, Heracles wandered like a phantom within the glorious walls of Thebes. His mighty arms swung uselessly, and his once victorious eyes saw only blood and regret. The most powerful hero on earth was now a rag, a cursed man. Upon his shoulders lay not just the crushing weight of a titan who had held up the sky, but the crushing burden of his own committed sins. In his desperation, seeking solace to mend the wounds of his soul, he turned his path toward the sacred temple of Apollo at Delphi. It was a long and arduous journey. Every piece of ground he stepped on stretched his cursed shadow, and every sip of water left a taste of dry regret in his throat. When he reached Apollo's sanctuary, Heracles' appearance was more like that of a weary and battered mortal than the son of a god. His hair was disheveled, his clothes were torn, and his gaze was filled with a deep emptiness. He climbed the marble steps of the temple and finally reached the chamber of the aged Pythia, who delivered the words of Apollo. The room was filled with the dense smell of incense. The heavy, mystical essence of wisdom and prophecy hung in the air. Heracles knelt. His arrogance, his strength, and even his hope had abandoned him. only one thing remained: the desire for atonement. And then the god's word began to flow from the Pythia's trembling lips. She declared that the son of Zeus's destiny would test him as a slave, informing him that he must submit to the command of his cowardly, cunning, and weak cousin, Eurystheus, even though Heracles should have been the heir to the throne of Mycenae. The hero would have to serve him for 12 years and complete the 10 great trials he would order. Only through this path, only in exchange for this great humility and ceaseless effort, she prophesied, would his soul be cleansed, the chains of mortality be broken, and he would earn the right to ascend to Olympus. The Pythia added that he would attain immortality upon completing these 10 tasks, and she bestowed upon him a new name, Heracles, meaning hero's glory, a name that symbolized that he would carry both his curse and his destiny on his shoulders forever. The prophecy, like an iron decree, was sealed upon Heracles' soul. He cast aside his pride and set off toward the magnificent walls of Tiryns to serve King Eurystheus, that small, trembling man. Eurystheus, upon hearing of Heracles' return, trembled with fear. This was a man of divine power, and he was now falling under the king's control. This fear sowed the seeds of a twisted plan in Eurystheus' mind. He could not scorn Heracles' power, but he could try to crush him, impose impossible tasks, and perhaps destroy him. As Heracles approached Tiryns, Eurystheus' first command became an iron cage for him. The king even forbade Heracles from entering the city, fearing to face him or even see him upon his victorious returns. From that moment on, all orders would be transmitted through the herald Copreus, a servant of Eurystheus, who bore a cursed mark on his brow, an echo of the king's own fears. And so Heracles' first task reached him in Copreus' mocking, thin voice. King Eurystheus was ordering Heracles to bring him the hide of the terrifying lion of Nemea. This was no ordinary hunt. This lion was a symbol of bloody terror. Focusing on this first task, the name of the Nemean Lion haunted the dreams of the shepherds on the Argolis plain, spoken of as a calamity more feared than the drought that withered the crops. This creature was not merely a fierce beast, but a divine horror, born from the blood of Typhon, the terrifying titan of the underworld, and the half-serpent woman, Echidna. Its hide could not be pierced by any weapon in mortal hands. Bronze spears, iron arrows, and sharp swords would strike its skin and bounce off like a fly's buzz. It was invincible. When Heracles received this command, he showed neither surprise nor fear. Only a cold glint of long-lost determination appeared on his face. Conquering this monster was not just a task for him, but the first step toward defeating the monster within himself. If he could overcome a creature that no mortal weapon could harm, perhaps his own cursed past could no longer touch him. He set off. As he moved away from the walls of Tiryns, that massive figure, carrying the shadow of the hero he once was, bore his bow on his back, his club by his side, and his famous bronze sword. In a short time, he reached Cleonae, a poor and modest town located on the road leading to the Nemean Valley. Cleonae carried an atmosphere of weariness and sorrow. The fields surrounding the city were empty, and the shepherds had abandoned their pens. When Heracles entered the city square, the silence was the restless quiet of a cemetery. It was in this somber atmosphere that Heracles was met by a humble victim of fate, an aged, poor peasant named Molorchus. Molorchus recognized Heracles. What mortal would not recognize this colossal son of Zeus? Yet, the sadness and exhaustion weighing upon Heracles softened the old man's heart. Molochus invited Heracles into his hut and shared whatever he had with him. Dry bread, a little olive oil, and sour wine. It was hospitality fit for a common traveler passing through, not a hero. Heracles' pride melted away in the face of this simple but genuine kindness. When Molochus asked his guest why he was there, Heracles told him he was after the Nemean Lion. This word drained all the blood from the old man's face. Clasping his hands, Molochus lamented that this cursed creature had taken his fields, his flocks, and even his son from him, crying that it was a plague upon the earth. Heracles looked at the old man. He had previously witnessed the fall of a city, the defeat of armies, but such personal, such deep anguish felt more real to him than Eurystheus's tyranny. At that moment, he understood that this task was not just about personal atonement, but also about making amends for the crimes he had committed against innocent people. With a trembling voice, old Molochus told Heracles that he wished to offer a sacrifice to Zeus for success before he began his journey. Heracles objected to the offer. His voice was like a rock. He wanted his aged friend to understand the uncertainty of his fate, and he told him that if he returned with the lion's hide within 30 days, they could then offer a sacrifice of thanks to Zeus the Savior. However, if the 30 days were up and he had not returned, Molochus should know he had died, and should then cut a sacrifice to honor him as a hero. These heavy words filled the old man's eyes with tears, but Heracles' determination prevented him from objecting. Heracles spent only one night in Molochus's hut. That night, the stars shone brightly, as if wanting to lighten the burden upon the hero. But Heracles' mind was beyond the lion's hide. He knew this trial was a kind of suicide mission. If he failed, death would be an escape from his bloody past. If he succeeded, 11 more terrifying trials awaited him. As the first rays of the sun painted the slopes of Nemea golden, Heracles departed from Molochus's hut and plunged into the cursed valley. The journey was from Cleonae toward the heart of the Nemean Valley. The valley was lush, thick, and deceptively beautiful. But this greenery was merely a curtain concealing death and terror. Heracles advanced, paying close attention to the shadows of the trees and rocks. He gripped his massive club tightly, carrying his bow and quiver on his shoulders. Heracles was a hunter who understood the language of nature and respected the laws of predator and prey. But the Nemean lion was unlike any prey he had ever known. This creature was not just a monster, but a curse seeping from the blood of Typhon. Heracles spent his first days tracking his prey. He had to learn the lion's routes, its hunting habits, and the area over which it spread its terror. The valley was full of abandoned farms, shattered pens, and forests shrouded in silence. With every step, Heracles saw the creature's enormous paw prints and the remains of its fresh kills. These prints were far larger, far more menacing than those of an ordinary lion. A week passed. Heracles searched for the lion in the valley during the day and rested in a safe place at night, either at the entrance of a cave or beneath a great oak tree. The hunt was difficult. The lion was invisible, as if merged with the mist and shadows. The creature was not just a hunter. It was an intelligent, cunning sovereign who knew every stone and every bush in the region. During this time, Heracles also confronted his own past. When night fell, in the dim light of the fire, The shadows of that horrible moment in Thebes gave him no peace. He had seen in the most painful way how his own strength could become an instrument of destruction. Now he had to use that strength to destroy a creature that took the lives of innocent people. This task gave him a chance to prove that power could bring not only destruction, but also salvation. Finally, at the end of the second week, Heracles found the lion's lair in the deepest, darkest, and most desolate part of the valley. This was an ancient mountain pass, formed by colossal, steep cliffs. At the entrance to the lair, the bones of a torn-apart goat and a sharp smell of roaring hung in the air. Heracles leaned his back against the cliff, his massive body almost blending with the rock. He began to wait patiently. A hunter's patience is close to a sage's serenity. Heracles waited for days without moving, observing the direction of the wind and the lion's time of return. His eyes were fixed on the dark mouth of the cave. His mind was completely empty. Neither the ghosts of the past nor the prophecy of the future bothered him anymore. There was only the present, the prey, the hunter, and the deadly silence required by the moment. At the beginning of the third week, as the afternoon sun scorched the Nemean valley, the wait ended. Through the sprawling meadows, the Nemean Lion emerged, slowly and with terrifying majesty. Its body was as thick and muscular as a bull's. Its mane, as if made of burning fire, was golden-colored and rippled like flames in the wind. But the most terrifying thing was its gaze. Yellow, cold, and intelligent eyes looked at Heracles, the most powerful man on earth. In that look, there was neither fear nor hatred, only endless hunger and a divine indifference. The lion was not an ordinary predator, but the embodiment of nature's ferocity. Heracles did not break his rock-solid stance. As the lion moved toward the cliffs, the hero quickly reached for his bow and quiver. This bow was a deadly weapon, dipped in the blood of the Lernaean Hydra, one of the Earth's most poisonous snakes, a trial he would face next, though Heracles did not know it then. As the arrow left the bowstring, it let out a sharp sound that cut the air. The arrow traveled with the speed of a hawk, aiming to embed itself between the lion's massive ribs on its flank, but an instant metallic clang was heard. The arrow fell to the ground without penetrating even a millimeter, as if the lion's hide were the thickest layer of hammered bronze armor. Only the arrow was shattered, its poisonous tip crushed. The lion did not even roar. It merely turned its head slowly, as if hearing the annoying buzz of an insect. Heracles' heart paused for a moment. He trusted the power of his arrows. Those arrows pierced the armor of mortal foes and felled even giants. But this creature was truly invulnerable. This reality overthrew all of Heracles' warrior logic, all the hunting rules he knew. This was a challenge not just to strength but to cunning and creativity. The lion continued to advance toward its cave, ignoring Heracles. The hero was filled with rage and a new determination. He dropped the bow and drew the sinuless sword from its sheath. This sword had been forged in the fire of Hephaestus, one of the sharpest metals in the world. Heracles approached the lion silently from behind, blending his slow steps with the whispers of the wind. Just as the creature reached the cave entrance, Heracles raised his sword with colossal force and brought it down onto the spot where the hide looked thickest, the area between the spine and the neck. The impact sound echoed in the valley. The sword shattered like a piece of glass. Only a small, meaningless nick, an almost invisible mark, remained on the lion's hide. This was the last resort in Heracles' arsenal. The legend of invulnerability was a bitter reality. The lion was finally irritated. It turned back, its eyes slowly fixing on Heracles. Its first roar was not just a sound of anger, it was an ancient sound, a divine challenge that shook the mountains, the stones, and Heracles' hope. The lion began to advance toward Heracles with heavy but swift steps. Heracles threw his sword aside. Now neither his sword nor his arrows nor his bow were useful. All that remained were his bare muscles and his pure, unrestrained strength. This situation brought a strange smile to Heracles' face. He was a man who always trusted his own power. Now he had to use that power in its purest and most primitive form. The lion charged toward Heracles at a gallop. Despite his massive size, Heracles sprang back with the agility of a panther. The lion's huge paws shattered the rock where Heracles had stood. The dust rose like a mist in the valley. Heracles had survived the first attack. Now he raised the only weapon he had left, his massive club made of long olive wood. This club had been made from an oak tree he had once uprooted. Its weight was a weapon that no ordinary human could ever lift. When the lion attacked again, Heracles gathered all his strength and brought the club down like a hammer, striking the lion between its brow bone and its eyes. The impact made a bone-crushing noise. The lion was stunned, its head tilted to the side, as if it had lost consciousness for a moment. This strike did not wound the lion, but it dazed it and gave Heracles a momentary advantage. The lion roared with fury and launched a vengeful attack against Heracles. But a plan formed in Heracles' mind. To defeat this creature, he had to overpower it not physically, but by strangulation. If its hide was too thick for weapons, then he had to cut off the breath of life inside. The lion knocked Heracles to the ground with a paw strike. Heracles hit his back against the cliffs, and the air was forced out of his lungs. The creature, sensing victory, leapt toward him to sink its teeth into the hero's throat. At this deadly moment, Heracles' survival instinct kicked in. He threw his weight aside, rolled, and slipped beneath the lion's massive body. As the lion looked around, confused about where its prey was, Heracles, with the suppleness of a snake, slipped out between its legs. He ran, breathless, but with a single goal in mind: the cave. The lion's lair was a colossal tunnel system with two separate entrances. This was a natural advantage, allowing the lion to quickly enter after a hunt and escape through the other door. Before entering this cave, Heracles quickly looked around. His mind worked with the skill of a master hunter. If he could seal the lion's escape route, he could corner it in a single area where it would face only him. Heracles ran toward the enormous rocks nearby. These rocks weighed tons, something no mortal man could ever move. But Heracles unleashed his divine strength once more. His muscles bulged like marble, every fiber summoning the power of the Titans. As sweat streamed from his eyes, Heracles lifted the first rock and rolled it towards the smaller second entrance of the cave. The rock rolled with a great noise and completely sealed the entrance. Then another and another. The second entrance was now completely blocked. By the time the lion realized the trap, it was already too late. Heracles returned to the main entrance of the cave, gripping his club, and walked into the darkness. The air inside was humid, heavy, and smelled of blood. In the depths of the cave, two yellow eyes waited for Heracles. The struggle began in the depths of the cave, in an arena ruled by silence and death. The sunlight outside was meaningless in this darkness. Heracles raised his club, but he knew it was only a distraction. The real battle would be a war of flesh and bone. The lion roared inside. The sound echoed off the stone walls, crashing down on Heracles like 1,000 roars. The creature lunged quickly toward Heracles. This time, Heracles did not retreat. He closed his eyes, allowing the ghosts of Megara and his children to enter for a moment. That pain gave him one last burst of strength, one last surge of fury. As the lion soared through the air, Heracles brought his massive club down once more onto the creature's head. The club's second strike stunned the lion's head, causing it to stumble for a moment. This was the only opportunity Heracles was looking for. He threw the club aside and lunged at the lion with all his speed. It was not an embrace, but a mortal struggle. Heracles' arms locked around the lion's neck. The lion's sharp teeth struggled in vain to reach the hero's arm. Heracles' biceps were as tight as iron. The lion thrashed in a panic. Its 4 colossal paws desperately clawed at the hero's body, the only weapons that could pierce the hide, resembling its own claws. The muscles in Heracles' back and chest were strained almost to the point of tearing his skin. He was not just grappling with a monster, he was grappling with a divine curse. The grapple was a primitive dance, spinning like a vortex on the dark floor of the cave. Heracles' lungs burned, and the veins in his neck pulsed as if they would burst. The lion's thrashing weakened with every passing second. With one final titanic surge of power, Heracles tightened his arms even more. The sound of the cartilage in its neck crushing created an eerie echo against the cave walls. Finally, the lion's massive body suddenly went limp. The yellow, wild light in its eyes slowly faded. Its tongue lolled out of its mouth. The Nemean Lion, the invincible one, had been defeated by the bare strength not just of a mortal, but of a demigod. Heracles released the dead body of the lion and stumbled backward. His eyes still hadn't adjusted to the darkness, but his heart, for the first time in a long time, beat with a cleansed hope. The victory was not merely a physical achievement, it was proof that Heracles could overcome his own curse. As Heracles tried to regulate his breathing, he looked at the lion's dead body. Now the second and more difficult part of the task began. Eurystheus wanted the hide. It had to be tangible proof of Heracles' victory. The hero tried his sword and arrows, but the hide resisted even the sharpest metal just as before. No matter what he did, no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't even make a scratch on the hide. This drove Heracles to despair. He had won the victory, but if he could not bring the proof, Eurystheus would deem the task unfinished. Looking around in desperation, Heracles' eyes caught the lion's massive, sharp claws. Suddenly an idea flashed in his mind. If the hide was so resistant to an external blow, perhaps its own nature was the only thing that could tear it apart. He sat down and carefully detached one of the lion's claws. The claw was as sharp as obsidian, as hard as diamond. Heracles began to cut the hide's skin using this claw like a knife. It worked. The claw easily separated the hide's fibers, peeling the skin from the flesh. As the last light of the setting sun filtered through the cave entrance, Heracles completed this delicate but arduous task. The lion's bloody hide was now his. He threw it over his shoulders and walked out. The air outside gave him a sense of freedom. The weight of the hide on Heracles' shoulders was no longer a curse, but a symbol of strength and honor. He put on the hide, placing the lion's massive head over his own like a helmet. In that moment, Heracles ceased to be an ordinary hero and became the embodiment of legend. The Nemean Lion's skin provided him with a second layer of invulnerability and made him a concrete display of that fearsome power. Now, the dawn of the 30th day was approaching. Heracles set off for Cleonae, the lion's hide over his shoulders. Along the journey, peasants saw Heracles' colossal silhouette from afar. When they saw the hide upon him, they were first afraid, then they understood. The lion was dead. The hero had completed his task. When Heracles reached Cleonae, the end of the 30th day had arrived. Molorchus had woken up with great sadness that morning. 30 days had passed, and the hero had not returned. As promised, he was leading his only remaining valuable animal, an old ram, to the altar to offer a sacrifice to Heracles' soul. His eyes were tearful. Like his own son, this great hero had fallen victim to the curse of Nemea. Just as he raised the sacrificial knife, he saw a colossal figure approaching from afar. The figure was like a burning sun, a human body, but with the head and hide of a monster. Molorchus froze in terror. He thought it was a ghost of the lion returning for vengeance. But as the figure approached, Molorchus noticed the weariness in its shoulders and the determination in its eyes. This was none other than Heracles. The old man threw the knife to the ground and ran toward Heracles. The two embraced. Molorchus wept with joy, crying out that the hero had returned and was alive, declaring that they must offer the promised sacrifice to Zeus the Savior. Upon Heracles' shoulders lay not only the weight of the hide, but also the prayers of innocent people. And so, the aged Molorchus and the young hero offered a sacrifice of thanks to Zeus the Savior at that humble altar. Heracles had saved both his own life and the people of Nemea. However, the task was not entirely finished. He had to deliver the hide to Eurystheus. Heracles advanced toward Tiryns in triumph, the lion's hide upon his shoulders. When he reached the city gates, the herald Copreus met him. Copreus's face went pale when he saw the imposing hide on Heracles' shoulders. This was not just a sign of victory, but also concrete proof of Heracles' power and potential danger. Copreus rushed to the palace and told Eurystheus what had happened. King Eurystheus's reaction was, as expected, fear and horror. Heracles' completion of this impossible task so easily and quickly drove the king into a panic. Heracles, cloaked in the hide, embodying the majesty of a god, would haunt the king's sleep. Trembling with fear, Eurystheus had the famous bronze jar constructed. This jar would be buried underground, and Eurystheus would hide inside it whenever danger approached, while watching Heracles' victories. From that moment on, the king strictly forbade Heracles from entering the city. All commands and tasks would now be given only through Copreus, from outside the city walls. Heracles smiled when he saw Eurystheus's cowardice. His pride had begun to sprout anew. He stood on this land where he had arrived as a murderer, now as a savior and a monster slayer. The Nemean Lion's hide was not merely a fur. It was his new identity, the beginning of his legend. And so Heracles' first great trial ended. By conquering the invincible, he had taken the first bloody and painful step on the road to immortality. But the journey had just begun, and Hera's curse, along with the 11 more terrifying trials awaiting him, would not leave Heracles' trail. The poisonous rivers of the Lernaean Hydra had already begun to flow across the hero's path. Fear spreads like a poison, but hope burns like a torch even in the darkest swamp. The majesty of Heracles, returning victorious from Nemea, sent a profound tremor through the heart of King Eurystheus, who dared not cross the walls of Tiryns. The hero wore the lion's invincible hide like armor, its colossal head as a helmet. This sight deepened the king's fear at the bottom of his bronze jar. Now, Eurystheus wished not just to crush this power, but to curse it. The herald Copreus, again with trembling steps, came outside the city walls to where Heracles waited. He was afraid even to smell the lion's hide on the hero. Copreus held a scroll with the royal seal in one hand, trying to hide the trembling of the other. His voice was thin and fragile like the whisper of the wind, and he delivered Eurystheus's command to the Son of Zeus for his new task, declaring that this task was a poisonous terror that would test not his strength, but his courage forever. And thus, the cursed name of the second trial was heard, the Lernaean Hydra. This name was a humid and deadly nightmare whispered in the swamps of not just Argolis, but all of Greece. The Hydra, like the Nemean Lion, was born from the vile union of the underworld titans, Typhon and Echidna. It lived in the bottomless, muddy marshes of Lerna, poisoning all life around it, and hunting innocent people and animals every night under the stars. According to legend, this monster had 9 heads. 8 were mortal, but the 9th, the most powerful one in the center, was immortal. Furthermore, when a head was cut off, 2 new, younger and wilder heads would immediately sprout from the gushing blood and pus. Even the Hydra's breath was a deadly poison. Inhaling the air that passed by it led to an instant and painful death. Eurystheus's goal was clear: to leave Heracles, no matter how strong he was, to die in the poisonous claws of an unbeatable enemy. Against the brute force that defeated the Nemean Lion, a challenge based on strategic intelligence and patience was now presented. Heracles shivered even inside the lion's hide as he listened to this cursed command. He knew the limits of his strength. He realized that brute force would be insufficient against this kind of biological horror. This war had to be won with mind, not just muscle. Heracles did not set out alone this time. He knew this task could not be solved by pure strength. He took with him his wise nephew, Iolaus, who remained loyal despite Heracles' painful past in Thebes. Iolaus was willing to share Heracles' destiny and was the hero's most trusted confidant and helper. He was a young man with a quick mind, capable of strategic thought, balancing Heracles' brute power. Heracles and Iolaus jumped into the chariot. Heracles drove the cart. As the wheels cut through the dry lands of Argolis, clouds of dust rose into the air. The expression on Heracles' face was different from the rage he carried when going to Nemea. Now, his face showed a serious focus, prepared for the approaching danger. Their journey was from the melancholic beauty of Nemea toward the eerie swamps of Lerna. Lerna was a humid and heavy region where stagnant waters and decaying vegetation spread, mixed with the salty breath of the Mediterranean. The air held a strange, sweetish smell. It resembled neither flower nor earth, but rather the stench of long-accumulated poison. Even the sky was covered with dark, leaden clouds hanging over the marsh. Heracles and Iolaus stopped at a point where the chariot wheels sank into the mud. This was near the spring of Amymone, the Hydra's lair. The spring, once sweet and clear, had now been contaminated by the Hydra's venom, turning into a dark, greenish fluid. Iolaus carefully examined the surroundings, telling his uncle that the smell was not that of a swamp, but as if metal, blood, and sulfur had combined. Heracles nodded under the protective shield of the lion's hide, stating that it was the breath of death, and they must avoid close contact with the monster, as it carried the venom not only in its bites, but also in its breath. The two left their horses at a safe distance and advanced silently toward the swamp. Every place they stepped was soft, squishy mud. Their footprints immediately filled with water behind them. The surrounding reeds and rushes were so tall that their visibility was limited. Heracles reactivated his hunting instincts. The Hydra would not emerge like a normal predator. It would hide in the depths of its lair, waiting for its prey. A challenge was needed to draw it out. After a while, Heracles realized that the Hydra's probable lair was a dark hollow beneath a high cliff. The hollow was situated right at the edge of the swamp water, its entrance surrounded by dense, poisonous water. Heracles turned to Iolaus and said that they should shoot flaming arrows into the hollow, as smoke and heat would force it out. This was a logical strategy. The Hydra's skin must have been cold and moist like snakeskin. Fire would disturb it. Iolaus quickly prepared a small torch from the dry tree branches they had brought. Heracles cut a strip from the thick hide of the lion's skin, which could only be cut with its own claw or another divinely sharp tool which made the Hydra's claw useful for the task, and wrapped the torch with it, preparing to light it. Heracles lit the torch and with enormous power hurled the flaming arrow toward the dark, humid mouth of the cave. The fiery arrow ripped through the air and fell among the dry grass and bones inside. Instantly, a thick, dense smoke began to seep out of the mouth of the hollow. The smell of the smoke, mingling with the scent of the venom, made the air unbreathable. As the smoke pushed the poisonous air inside the cave outwards, a deep, growling sound was heard from underground. This was not the sound of an ordinary animal. It was a sickening roar carrying the wrath of the underworld gods. And then that horrible sight appeared before the swamp. The Hydra slowly, slitheringly emerged from the cave's mouth. Its body was as thick as a colossal anaconda's, covered in scales. These scales gleamed with a wet and nauseating green in the reflected light of the swamp. But the terrifying sight was the 9 separate serpentine necks sprouting from its body. Each head looked in a different direction, its eyes shining in the darkness. Dense blackish smoke and heavy acidic saliva dripped from the mouth of each head. The Hydra's weight and power were greater than anything Heracles had ever encountered. It was not just an enemy, but a moving chemical weapon that destroyed life around it. The Hydra lumbered toward Heracles. Its walk was slow and ominous, like the rocking of a ship. Its 9 heads approached Heracles and Iolaus like a bundle. Heracles shouted, his voice muffled by the hard surface of the lion's hide, telling Iolaus to draw back and that the creature's breath alone would kill him. Iolaus obeyed the command and quickly retreated, reaching a safe distance near the chariot. But Heracles did not retreat. He had devised a strategy, and this strategy had to be executed at close range, where the monster's roar and venom were most concentrated. Heracles gripped his massive club tightly. The lion's hide could protect him from external bites and claw strikes, but if the poison itself seeped into his body through the air, no protection would work. Heracles held his breath. The Hydra's 9 heads hissed and whistled, filling the air with venomous sounds. Heracles used his club to strike between the Hydra's necks. The blow was like the strike of a sledgehammer. The Hydra trembled in pain, its scaly body shaking. This attack enraged the monster. 3 of its heads lunged at Heracles simultaneously. Heracles leaped with incredible agility, but one head struck the shoulder section of the lion's hide. The hide absorbed the blow, but the force of the impact knocked Heracles to the ground. Heracles fell onto the muddy, venomous ground. The Hydra's heads performed a serpentine dance around him. Heracles did not panic. He quickly rose and grabbed the nearest head of the monster with his bare hands. He squeezed its throat. The Hydra struggled, its head's teeth trying to reach Heracles' arms, but the hide protected him. Heracles, with his immense strength, separated the head from the body. The bloody head fell into the mud, and before Heracles could savor the brief taste of victory, he saw the horrifying truth. Two new, younger and wilder heads instantly sprouted from the stump where the severed head had been. Heracles recoiled in horror. It had increased from 8 heads to 9, then to 10. His strength only served to multiply the monster's terror. By cutting just one head, he was engineering his own demise. This moment was a turning point in Heracles' warrior career. He had always relied on his muscles. Now, his muscles were failing him. This battle had to be one of strategy. He was not just a heap of muscle, but a hero who also carried the intellect of Zeus. He retreated. As he ran through the marsh, the Hydra's heads scattered poisonous saliva around him. The Hydra's 9th immortal head swayed in the middle of the others, larger and more menacing. Heracles reached the chariot where his nephew Iolaus was. He was breathless and declared that brute force was not working, that each head doubled, and this was a deadlock. Iolaus saw Heracles' exhaustion and frustration. He knew about this characteristic of the Hydra. Iolaus told his uncle that they had to stop the heads from sprouting and cauterize the severed areas before the snakeskin could heal itself. This was an excellent idea. Fire. If they could instantly burn the wound, the bleeding would stop, and the growth of new heads would be prevented. Heracles' eyes shone with gratitude and appreciation, and he asked his nephew to think fast, to go gather dry wood nearby and prepare a torch to keep the fire alive. Iolaus did not hesitate for a moment and ran to carry out the task. Heracles advanced toward the Hydra again. This time, he had an assistant, a strategic support. This was the moment Heracles ceased to be a solitary hero and became a commander. Jealous quickly gathered dry bushes and wood from the surroundings. He made a torch and lit it from the small fire Heracles had previously started. The flames burned vividly, even in the humid air of the swamp. Heracles re-entered the Hydra's range. The monster, with its 10 heads, was much more terrifying than before. Heracles, under the protection of the lion's hide, used his massive club like a sword, parrying the snake's attacks. The battle was now one of endurance and timing. Heracles pinned the 2 nearest heads to the ground with his club. He quickly grabbed a sharp, axe-sized piece of stone, sharp enough to cut the Hydra's poisonous skin, and severed one head as quickly as possible. Heracles roared, "Now, Iolaus!" Iolaus ran, holding the burning torch. He pressed the flames of the torch onto the spot where the severed head's blood was gushing. A loud hiss was heard. The edges of the wound instantly blackened and hardened. The growth of new heads was prevented. A smile of victory, the first in a long time, appeared on Heracles' face. Strategy had defeated brute force. However, the early joy of victory was cut short by another terror. The goddess Hera was watching this battle from the heavens. She was furious that Heracles had found such a clever solution. She wanted Heracles to fail and considered this aid a trick. Suddenly, another creature, surpassing even the horror of the Hydra, emerged from the depths of the swamp. The crab Carcinus. This was a colossal crab sent by Hera. Its shell was as hard as rock, and its claws were like iron pincers. The crab attacked Heracles' foot at his most vulnerable moment. The claw seized Heracles' foot. The pain spread through Heracles' body like an electric current. This distracted him. The Hydra, taking advantage of this opportunity, attacked Heracles with its remaining heads. Poisonous breaths were closing in on the hero's face. Heracles roared in pain. The lion's hide provided protection against the poison, but the crab's pincers were about to pierce the skin. For a moment, he thought he would die in the Hydra's venomous clutches. But Iolaus was not just an assistant. He was a brave young man who carried Heracles' blood. Evading the Hydra's heads, he quickly threw the torch he was holding at the crab. The fire struck the crab's shell, causing it to crack. The crab writhed in pain and released Heracles' foot. Heracles was saved. He quickly grabbed his massive club from the ground and struck the armor of the crab Carcinus with all his might. The crab was crushed like a piece of rock and sank into the swamp mud. This proved that Iolaus's heroism and Heracles' determined strength could overcome even divine intervention. Despite his injured foot, Heracles focused on the Hydra again. This time, he and Iolaus were in perfect synchronization. Heracles severed the heads one by one, keeping the monster under pressure with his strength. Iolaus, after each cut, pressed his torch against the wound, never missing the fatal moment before the freshness of the cut was lost. Hiss, hiss, hiss. The swamp was filled with the gushing blood of the severed heads and the foul vapor of the cauterized wounds. The Hydra writhed in agony with every head it lost, its colossal body shaking the swamp. 9 heads dwindled to 7, then 5, then 3, and finally, just a single head remained. This remaining head was different from the others. It was the central immortal head. This head did not attack wildly like the others. It moved slower, more carefully. Its eyes looked at Heracles as if seeing not just an enemy, but also its own destiny. Its venom was more concentrated, and its breath had a heavier odor of sulfur. Heracles knew that cutting this head would not bring new ones, but he also knew it was impossible to destroy it. He had to neutralize it. Heracles gathered all his strength and lunged at the Hydra's single remaining neck. He pinned it to the ground. The immortal head thrashed wildly, its teeth approaching Heracles' face dangerously. Iolaus knew there was nothing more to do. The fire of his torch could not cauterize this head. Heracles pinned this final head to the ground under the lion's hide. He fixed its neck with his club. Then he looked around and saw a massive rock fragment. This rock was a piece shattered during the crab's attack. With a final titanic effort, Heracles lifted this stone. He felt as if he were carrying all the weight of the earth and the sky on his shoulders. And then he dropped the rock onto the immortal head. Thud. The sound echoed through the swamp. The immortal head was crushed, but not destroyed. It was still alive under the swamp, trembling in the mud. However, it was no longer a threat. Heracles had completed this part of his task. Exhausted but triumphant, Heracles rose. He had completed the task. He had defeated the Lernaean Hydra. Now, the real danger began. Skinning the Hydra, like the Nemean Lion, was impossible. Even the creature's scaly hide was poisonous. Heracles cut into the body of the Hydra's unkillable immortal head. From there he collected the monster's venomous blood. This blood was the deadliest poison the earth had ever seen. Even a single drop could instantly kill a mountain man. Heracles coated the tips of his arrows with this venom. These arrows were already strengthened by underworld waters and poisonous herbs, but now, coated with the Hydra's venom, they became the world's deadliest weapons. Never again would an arrow shot by Heracles merely wound its target. It would subject it to instant and painful death. These arrows would give Heracles a great advantage in his subsequent tasks, but this action also sealed his own fate. This poison would one day bring about his own end. At that moment, Heracles was unaware of this. He only thought he had gained a new power. Iolaus watched everything in silence. He saw his uncle's heroism and the horror of it. He understood how superhuman strength, when combined with strategic intelligence, could become a force of destruction. As Heracles and Iolaus left Lerna, a dark mist rose from the Hydra's poisonous remnants over the swamp. The two were more weary this time, but also wiser. Heracles had defeated not only a monster, but also his own arrogance. Now he trusted his mind as much as his strength. When they returned to Tiryns, Colpreus met Heracles. Colpreus looked with horror at the lion's hide on Heracles and the poisonous arrows in his hand. With every task, this man was becoming a more terrifying power. Heracles declared his victory and announced that the task was complete. Colpreus quickly ran to the palace next to Eurystheus's bronze jar. The king, hearing that Heracles was alive, was filled with rage and horror. Eurystheus refused to acknowledge Heracles' success. His voice muffled from inside the jar. He yelled that the task would not count because Heracles had won the victory with the help of Iolaus, and a hero must complete his tasks alone. This was a trick. This rejection cut a deep wound in Heracles' soul. He was working for atonement, but Eurystheus's cowardice and jealousy were devaluing his efforts. Heracles controlled his rage. He knew that Eurystheus would only count 10 tasks, and Heracles would continue this servitude until he completed 12. Even if Eurystheus refused to accept the task, the death of the Hydra was a fact. Heracles looked at Colpreus, his voice like thunder. He told him to inform the king that he was under the command of the gods, not Eurystheus, that whether the task counted or not, the Hydra was dead. And while Eurystheus hid cowardly in his jar, he would complete the 12 trials demanded by the gods and attain immortality. Colpreus quickly fled. Heracles stood alone outside the walls of Tiryns, the lion's hide on his shoulders and the poisoned arrows in his hand. The second trial was complete, but 10 more tasks awaited him. Eurystheus would challenge Heracles. The next task would require speed and patience. Eurystheus would send Heracles to capture the Lernaean Hind of Artemis. This was to be a long and arduous pursuit, a task to be caught, not killed. Heracles would have to prove both his speed and his respect for the gods. Fatigue is sometimes a hero's heaviest burden, yet patience is the invisible wing that carries him to immortality. Although the poisonous blood of the Lernaean Hydra had turned Heracles' arrows into the mortal world's most terrifying weapons, this success did nothing to quench the hatred in King Eurystheus' heart. From the depths of his bronze jar, the king realized that Heracles' power was immeasurably great. Therefore, the next task would force Heracles to contend not with a physical battle, but with time, distance, and divine laws. Colpreus, even this time, dared not approach Heracles' formidable stance. From a hill outside the walls, he mixed his trembling voice with the wind and announced that King Eurystheus commanded him to capture the sacred Lernaean Hind of Artemis, the goddess of the hunt and the wild. He emphatically stated that the hind, which lived in Cyrenea, must be brought alive to Mycenae, and that Heracles must not harm it or even touch a single one of its hairs. For Copreus warned that the deer was the goddess's cursed gift, and any harm done to it would bring the wrath of goddess Artemis upon him. This task was an entirely new challenge for Heracles. His first two labors had been brutal, bloody fights. This, however, was a test of finesse, patience, and honor. Eurystheus had designed this task to ensure Heracles would either fail or incur the wrath of a goddess. The hind was not merely fast, it was sacred, and to harm it could drag even the Son of Zeus down to the Underworld. The Lernaean hind was no ordinary animal. According to legend, its antlers were made of shimmering gold, and its hooves appeared to be forged from bronze. It could run faster than the wind itself, and never tired. Goddess Artemis had captured 7 deer to pull her hunting chariot, but this last one, the most beautiful and fastest, remained a sacred secret. It roamed the untouched forests of Arcadia, nestled at the foothills of Mount Cerynea. The reference in the title to the Sacred Hind in India, while a deviation from the general mythological account of Apollodorus, can be accepted as a storyteller's liberty to emphasize the difficulty of the task and the extraordinary distances the deer reached. This pursuit would not merely span Arcadia, but would be an effort extending over years, surpassing the boundaries of the known world. When Heracles received this command, he smiled, feeling he had a chance to restore his reputation not as a killer, but as a hunter. He was known for his bow and the arrows dipped in the Hydra's venom. Now, despite all these deadly weapons, he had to swear an oath not to harm the deer. He set out, clad in the hide of the Nemean Lion, with his bow and quiver slung over his shoulder. His mind was now set to a completely different mode: ambush and tracking. This was an art that demanded a hunter's deepest patience. Upon reaching Arcadia, Heracles plunged into the depths of the forest. These woods differed from the poisonous swamps and bloody valleys of his first 2 tasks. This place possessed a silent, peaceful, and divine beauty. But this tranquility was deceptive. When Heracles first spotted the hind, he was mesmerized. Its golden antlers shone in the sunlight as if emitting a pure light. Its bronze hooves seemed to hover in the air without touching the ground, and its graceful body danced with the wind. It was not an animal, but a divine work of art. The moment the hind sensed Heracles approaching, it fled with the speed of an arrow, and so began the world's longest chase. This was not a week-long effort. It would take Heracles a full year, and according to some accounts, even longer. He pursued the hind from the mountains of Arcadia to the plains of the Peloponnese, and from there to the furthest corners of the known world. Heracles ran after the hind for days, weeks, and months. The hind climbed the steepest slopes, crossed the deepest rivers, and plunged into the densest forests. Even beneath the Nemean Lion's hide, Heracles sweated, but he would not give up. He was the son of Zeus. Fatigue was merely a temporary state for him. The speed of the hind was something beyond Heracles' muscular strength. It was a supernatural swiftness, granted by Artemis's blessing. Heracles did not only track the deer, but also learned its habits, its sleeping routine, and its watering holes. He sought to forge a bond with the hind, to understand it. This was not a hunt, but a dance, a mutual display of respect. The hind led Heracles beyond the borders of Hellas, Greece. Following it, Heracles felt the icy winds of Thrace in the north, then reached the sunny shores of Italy in the west. Legends say that, while chasing the hind, Heracles traveled to places unreachable even by Boreas, the god of the north wind. During this time, Heracles focused on nothing but the food he ate and the water he drank. His mind was completely empty. He only followed the deer's trail, the slightest mark left by its hooves. Throughout this long and exhausting process, he grew both physically stronger and gained mental serenity. This was what he needed after the bloody battle with the Hydra. His curse and sins slowly drifted away from his mind during this endless pursuit. As a storyteller, it is important to emphasize the shadow that extended to unknown lands in this epic. Heracles finally reached the eastern boundaries of the known world, the most distant regions of Asia, the legendary lands where the sun rises. The hind was not just running, it was maneuvering Heracles through known and unknown geographies to test his divine strength and resolve. In the fertile, monsoon-drenched lands of India, Heracles saw the golden antlers of the hind glitter through the exotic towering trees. The hind would sometimes stop on a mountaintop or across a river waiting for Heracles. It was as if telling him that he must push beyond his limits if he wished to catch it. In these lands, Heracles heard the legends of heroes who traveled just like him. He was not just following a deer, he was redrawing the map of the world. He met people outside his own culture and faith. He did not understand their languages, but he understood their hospitality and their terror. This was a journey where he witnessed the diversity of humanity. Months chased seasons. The lion's hide Heracles wore was soaked in the rain, dried in the sun, and battered by the wind. Yet, that hide remained upon him as a testament to the hero's perseverance. The pursuit lasted exactly 1 year and 1 day. During this time, Heracles had not shown the slightest act of violence toward Artemis's sacred animal. He was merely observing, waiting, and running. This was not what Eurystheus had expected. The king had hoped Heracles would lose patience and kill the hind, thereby incurring the goddess's wrath. Finally, Heracles' strategy led the hind back to Greece. The hind was tired from the long journey. It was now running toward its final sanctuary, the cool waters of the river Ladon in Arcadia. The river's waters were icy cold and created a kind of natural barrier. The hind had to slow down as it crossed the river. Heracles had been waiting for this exact moment. He hid behind a tree on the riverbank. As the hind's bronze hooves pressed into the pebbles at the riverbed, Heracles made a final lunge. He leaped onto the hind, but he could not use his brute force to capture it. The hind was so fast that Heracles had to not only catch it, but immobilize it. Heracles tripped the hind by its legs. The deer thrashed desperately. Its golden antlers swung toward Heracles, but the hero was protected by the lion's hide. In this chaotic moment, Heracles formed a plan in his mind. He could not use his poisoned arrows, but he could use the bowstring in his quiver. Quickly, he pulled a knotted snare from his quiver. This was a special rope, crafted with Heracles' hunting skills, used to tie animals without wounding them. He flung the snare with the speed of a snake and gracefully bound all 4 of the hind's legs. The hind struggled in the river's water, but could not escape. Heracles plunged into the deep water and lifted the hind onto his back. He had not harmed it. He had captured it alive. As Heracles emerged from the river with the hind on his back, savoring his triumph, he heard a whisper behind him. It was not the sound of the wind. It was the voice of the goddess Artemis, the goddess of the forests and hunters, filled with fury. When Artemis saw the hind captured, she appeared before Heracles as if launched from the heavens, accompanied by her twin brother, Apollo. The sight of the goddess was breathtaking. She held her silver bow, shimmering with moonlight. Her eyes blazed with pure anger. Artemis thundered, asking how Heracles, the cursed son of Zeus, dared to touch her sacred animal and enslave it, proclaiming that he was stealing her hind and reminding him that any harm done to it would return to him 1,000-fold. Apollo watched Heracles silently. Even within the lion's hide, Heracles' neck trembled before the goddess's wrath. Heracles knelt without putting the hind down from his back. He bowed his head humbly and explained to great Artemis in a low but firm voice that he had not shown disrespect toward her or the high residents of Olympus, but that he was a cursed man who had to atone for the sins he committed with his own hands, and was under the command of that wretched Eurystheus. Heracles continued, explaining that Eurystheus had hoped he would either defy the goddess and perish, or fail the task, but he had kept his reverence for the gods. He had followed the graceful animal for a full year, neither shooting an arrow nor throwing a stone, and had captured it alive, promising that the hind would be a symbol of this forced servitude and would be released immediately after being delivered to Eurystheus. Artemis listened to Heracles. She was moved by the hero's humility and honesty. The remorse and exhaustion on Heracles' face were genuine, not feigned. Artemis smiled. It was a cold smile, but it indicated Heracles was forgiven. She told the son of Zeus that his intentions were cleaner than his cousin's malice, and commanded him to go and show the hind to Eurystheus. However, she warned him to keep his word, stating that the hind could not be imprisoned within the walls of Mycenae, must be shown and immediately returned, warning that if the slightest harm came to it, the earth would be too small for him to escape her wrath. Heracles told the great goddess that he gave his word, and that the hind would not remain within Eurystheus's walls for even a single day. With that, Artemis and Apollo ascended toward the sky. Heracles breathed a sigh of relief. He had not only completed the task, but had also escaped the wrath of a goddess. Heracles set off toward Mycenae with the hind on his back. Even on Heracles' back, the hind still carried the spirit of the wild. Its bronze hooves glittered over the hero's shoulders. Upon reaching Mycenae, Copreus was astonished to see Heracles and the golden-antlered hind on his back. This was an impossible task that had lasted a year. Copreus swiftly informed Eurystheus. Eurystheus emerged from his jar, mesmerized by the deer's beauty, and shouted for them to lock it immediately in the palace garden. Eurystheus wanted to keep this sacred animal as a symbol of his own wealth and power. However, Heracles did not forget the promise he had made to Artemis. In a loud and clear tone, he told the king that the animal did not belong to him, but was the sacred hind of Artemis. He stated that he had brought it to prove he had completed his task, and now, as he had promised, he must set it free. Eurystheus furiously shouted at Heracles, proclaiming that he was his slave, that he could not question his orders, and that he must keep the hind. Heracles placed the hind down. As Artemis had suggested, a moment of cunning was required. The instant he lowered the hind, he quickly untied the knotted snare. The hind sprang out like an arrow shot from a bow, instantly bolting from Mycenae's crowded square. Its speed carried it away from the walls of Mycenae in the blink of an eye. Eurystheus could only catch the fleeting silhouette of the deer. In despair, he turned to Heracles and bellowed, asking what he had done. Heracles humbly bowed to the king, stating that he had completed his duty, brought the animal and shown it to him, but that it belonged to the gods. He explained that he had neither harmed it nor imprisoned it forever, thereby fulfilling not only his duty to the king, but also his oath to the gods. Eurystheus could neither act against Heracles nor punish him. Heracles had both completed the task and escaped Artemis's wrath. The king could only fume in rage. However, Eurystheus had one more card to play. He had discounted the Hydra task. This meant Heracles still had 2 tasks left to complete. Eurystheus's 10 labors would become Heracles's 12. Heracles had successfully completed this epic pursuit, stretching from India to the river Ladon. He had captured not only the hind, but also his own inner serenity and patience. The next task commanded by King Eurystheus would test Heracles' newfound patience by combining it with brute force, chaos, and horror. Heracles now had to pursue the wild Erymanthian Boar, a bloody adventure that would not only physically challenge him, but also determine his fate with his centaur comrade. Anger is a storm. Sometimes it carries a hero to his destination, and sometimes it consumes him. By capturing and releasing the Lernaean Hind, Heracles had both fulfilled his duty to Eurystheus and kept his sacred oath to the goddess Artemis. King Eurystheus's rage facing this clever maneuver bubbled like a cauldron within his bronze jar. Having witnessed Heracles' patience and wit, Eurystheus had to find a task that would force the hero to forget these new virtues and compel him back toward his primal strength. The herald Copreus advanced from the walls toward Heracles with trembling steps once again. This time, Copreus's voice was hoarse with fear, for the lion hide draped over Heracles stood as a testament not to a curse, but to the reality of the hero's power. Copreus, in a voice like a whisper, announced the 4th labor, conveying the king's command to capture the ferocious wild boar that lived on Mount Erymanthos in the heart of Arcadia. He stressed that the boar, a scourge that destroyed fields, flocks, and people, must be captured alive and brought before the king in Mycenae, where Eurystheus desired to see it chained and delivered. At first glance, this task resembled the Nemean Lion labor: defeat a monster and bring it back alive. However, the terror of the Erymanthian Boar came not just from its size, but from its uncontrollable savagery. This boar was no divine creature, but the embodiment of nature's purest, most destructive rage. Its tusks were sharp as crescents, and its muscles were hard as rock. All the villagers of Mount Erymanthos were trapped in their homes by the beast's fear. When Heracles received this order, a slight weariness appeared on his face. It was the same crude test of strength again, but he was on a journey of atonement and had to accept the task. This time, before he set out, companionship and fate created an unexpected bend in Heracles' path. Mount Erymanthos lay in the steepest and most inaccessible regions of Arcadia. As Heracles began his ascent into the mountains, the surrounding landscape was far more magnificent than the swamps of the Hydra or the valleys of Nemea, yet it was equally perilous. The tracks of the wild boar had left gigantic rifts across the fields and the forest floor. Later in his journey, Heracles' path led him to a cave inhabited by the centaur race. Centaurs were creatures with the body of a horse and the torso of a man, known for their wild, drunken, and uncontrolled nature. However, there were exceptions among them, and the owner of this cave was an old centaur named Pholos, who was kind, hospitable, and full of wisdom. He was a friend and student of Chiron, which set him apart from the other centaurs. Pholos welcomed Heracles with great honor, inviting him into his cave in a deep and friendly tone and telling him to rest his weariness, thus offering his hospitality. Pholos offered Heracles roasted meat and wild berry wine. Heracles was pleased to satisfy his hunger and relaxed in Pholos's generous company. When Pholos learned the purpose of Heracles' journey, he warned him that the wild boar was no ordinary animal, but carried the rage of the mountain spirit, and that capturing it was difficult and controlling it impossible. During the meal, Heracles desired to drink wine. Though Pholos willingly shared his food, he hesitated when Heracles asked for the wine. Pholos shifted his horse body restlessly, explaining that the wine was hidden there, a sacred cask belonging to the entire centaur race, entrusted to them by Dionysus, and that opening it was only possible if the entire race gathered, which was why he feared opening it without permission. Wine, the centaur's greatest weakness and curse. Heracles knew this wine represented the fine line that separated Pholos from the other centaurs, but Heracles had come from a long pursuit. He was tired, and he desired wine. Moreover, he was the son of Zeus. A cask of Dionysus could not stop him. Heracles smiled. Heracles then assured Pholos that he was his friend, the son of Zeus, and was on a divine mission, so a cask of wine could not hinder this hospitality, and even though the cask belonged to the whole race, he guaranteed that he would protect Pholos from their wrath, thus persuading him to open it. With great reluctance, Pholos opened the large oak wood cask hidden in the deepest corner of the cave. As soon as the wine was opened, a magnificent, intoxicating aroma spread into the air. This scent was unlike that of ordinary wine. It was the essence of Dionysus's wild nature, joy, and lack of control. The scent of the sacred cask traveled with the wind to the peaks of Mount Erymanthos, toward the sanctuaries of the other centaurs. Centaurs were creatures inherently wild and fond of wine. This aroma awakened their primal instincts, the years of suppressed anger and greed. This wine was their sacred heritage, and now it had been opened by a mortal, a stranger. Inside the cave, Heracles and Pholos were enjoying the wine, but outside, the sound of horse hooves and wild roars began to be heard. Hundreds of centaurs were galloping toward Pholos's cave. Their eyes burned with pure rage and desire for the wine. They carried torches, clubs, and massive rocks. They were the uncontrolled fury of nature, recognizing no rules of civilization. Pholos in horror cried out, lamenting what he had done, stating that the centaurs would never forgive him, and that he had brought Dionysus's curse upon them. Heracles' voice, rising like a war cry, told his friend Pholos not to fear, that he would protect him, and that this mistake was his own, and he would pay the price. Heracles remained calm. He had the lion hide on his back and his colossal club in his hand. He finished his cup, took a deep breath, and walked toward the cave entrance. The centaurs reached the mouth of the cave. The first attackers hurled massive rocks at Heracles. Heracles, with the strength of a titan, caught the rocks in mid-air and hurled them back at them. The rocks struck the centaurs' heads, and the sound of cracking bones filled the air. Heracles was fighting this time with the same primal strength that defeated the Nemean Lion. The centaurs were superior in number, but Heracles possessed immortal power. He felled each one of them, one by one, with his club. However, even with the tide turning in Heracles' favor, the battle was perilous. As the centaurs approached the cave, Heracles was forced to resort to his weapons. He pulled out the arrows dipped in the Hydra's venom from his quiver. Heracles had to make the most difficult decision for a hero, to use his poisoned arrows to protect his own life. These arrows doomed every target they struck to an immediate and painful death. Heracles' bow sliced through the air, singing a song of death. The arrows pierced the centaurs' bodies. The acid, spreading through their bodies like a serpent's venom, caused the centaurs to collapse in agony. Their bodies immediately began to decay. The poison destroyed life down to their very cells. The remaining centaurs panicked at this horror. They were not just wild creatures, but children of nature who did not know that death could be so swift and cruel. The centaurs retreated desperately. Heracles stood at the cave entrance, carrying the horror of the battle and the bitter taste of victory. He had defeated not only monsters, but also the savagery triggered by the divine wine. However, the tragedy was just beginning. When the battle ended, Pholos emerged from the cave. He trembled as he looked at the horror of the battle and the corpses of the dead centaurs. His peaceful nature was shattered by this bloodbath. Pholos curiously examined a poisoned arrow lodged in a centaur's chest. He was a master of poisons, but this venom was unlike anything he knew. As Pholos removed the arrow and examined it, the shaft slipped from his hand. The tip accidentally pierced Pholos's foot. Pholos roared in pain. Heracles instantly ran to Pholos's side. Heracles cried out in horror what Pholos had done. He knew how deadly the Hydra's venom was. The greenish veins on Pholos's horse body immediately darkened as the poison spread. He was in unbearable agony. Heracles used all his medical knowledge, trying to suck out the poison, but this venom was made from the blood of a legendary monster. There was no cure. Pholos collapsed into Heracles' arms. As he took his last breath with deep sorrow in his eyes, he said that his fate was sealed not by the wine of Dionysus, but by the venom of Heracles' heroism. Heracles was devastated. With his own hands, with his own weapon, he had caused the death of one of his closest friends. This tragedy was as great as the one where he killed his family in Thebes, but far more personal. He understood in the most bitter way that his strength and weapons could kill not only his enemies but also the innocent. Heracles buried Pholos on the side of the mountain next to the cave with the honor of a hero. He covered the grave with massive stones and mourned over the tomb for a long time. This grief was a sign that the curse on Heracles' soul would not abandon him, no matter how powerful he became. He was not just a monster hunter, but also a man of sorrow. After mourning Pholos, Heracles had to return to his duty. He channeled his grief into a focused anger against the Erymanthian Boar. Heracles climbed to the peaks of Mount Erymanthos. The boar lived in the high, snowy and icy regions. The monster was enormous, its bristles muddy and stiff and its ears torn. Its roar echoed throughout the entire mountain. Heracles now knew that brute force was not always the solution. He had to capture this boar alive. This was a battle of wits, like capturing the hind. The boar attacked fiercely, but Heracles was protected by the lion hide. Heracles pursued the boar for a long time. During the chase, an idea came to him to exhaust the boar and trap it. Heracles drove the boar toward the highest, snowiest, and coldest regions of the mountain. Thanks to the lion hide, he was resistant to the cold, but the boar sank in the snow and tired quickly. With tireless determination, Heracles chased the boar for hours, even days. Finally, the boar fell into a pit covered with deep, soft snow. It was exhausted from fatigue and cold. It tried to climb out of the pit, but the snow pulled it deeper. That was Heracles' moment. He approached the pit. The boar attempted to lunge at Heracles with a final cry of rage, but it had no strength left. Heracles pulled out his sturdy ropes, which were not poisoned by the Hydra's venom. He swiftly bound the boar's enormous body and sharp tusks. The monster thrashed in despair, but the ropes were tightened with Heracles' divine strength. The boar was defeated. Heracles hoisted the boar onto his massive shoulders and set off toward Mycenae. Even on Heracles' shoulders, the boar was still roaring and struggling. This sight was a living testament to Heracles' strength and savagery. As they approached Mycenae, Copreus and the city's populace were terrified to see Heracles arriving with this horrifying burden. Heracles set the boar down in the square of Mycenae. Though bound, the beast roared with savage energy. When King Eurystheus heard this spectacle, he trembled with fear. He hid at the bottom of his bronze jar, unable to believe that Heracles had brought the boar back alive. Heracles dragged the boar into the middle of the square. Then he called out to Copreus, commanding him to tell his king that the Erymanthian boar was here, alive, and that he had delivered it. Eurystheus, from inside his jar, could only hear the massive boar's roar and Heracles' mocking voice. Eurystheus' fear was so great that he never dared to face Heracles again. From inside the jar, Eurystheus whispered an order to Copreus to remove this monster immediately, and to tell Heracles that his next labor would be a test of humility that would shake his honor and strength. Heracles hoisted the boar back onto his shoulders and set off to return it to the mountains. The fourth labor was complete, but this task had left Heracles with the bitter grief of Pholos's death alongside a great victory. Heracles now knew that his power could destroy not only monsters, but also his friends. King Eurystheus' next test would push Heracles to the deepest point of filth and humiliation. The fifth labor, the cleaning of the Augean Stables. This would not be about cleaning a king's barn, but about cleaning a hero's honor. Pride exalts a hero, but true heroism lies in performing even the most humble duties with honor. Heracles, having overcome 4 great trials with a mixture of brute force and strategic intelligence, now faced the most insidious, most degrading blow from King Eurystheus. Eurystheus understood he could not defeat Heracles' physical strength, so he sought to morally break the hero. To reduce the son of a god to the level of a common slave, a menial cleaner, would be the king's only solace. The herald Copreus, even this time, did not dare approach Heracles' imposing presence. But now the disgust and revulsion in his voice overcame his fear, and he announced the fifth labor, stating that King Eurystheus commanded Heracles to clean the stables of King Augeas of Elis in a single day. Copreus declared that this was a servant's job, unfit for a hero, and ordered the Son of Zeus to go and soil his hands with filth, proving he was Eurystheus' slave. This command was designed to wound Heracles' honor entirely. Heracles was a warrior, the son of a god, wearing the hide of the Nemean Lion and carrying arrows tipped with Hydra venom. Now, he was forced to clean a farmer's mess. King Augean was one of the richest and most arrogant kings of Elis. He was believed to be the son of the sun god Helios. His wealth was measured not only in gold and silver, but also in livestock. Augean possessed a colossal herd of 3,000 animals, consisting solely of oxen, cows, goats, and sheep. But this herd came with a price: the stables. The king's stables had not been cleaned for 30 years. The animal dung accumulated over 3 decades had formed a massive mountain on the floor, walls, and even the roof of the stables. The filth had poisoned not only the stables, but also the surrounding fields and lands, spreading a foul stench across all of Elis. This was a task impossible to clean with human strength. Even opening the stable doors was like facing the collapse of a mountain. Eurystheus's plan was simple. Either Heracles would abandon this disgusting task and lose his reputation, or he would attempt to clean it, condemning him to months, perhaps years, in a degrading pit of filth. Eurystheus sought to break Heracles' strength, honor, and patience all at once. Heracles approached this humiliating task with greater reluctance than the others. He had to put aside his brute strength, as his immense muscles could not help him clean this filth. This task required planning and engineering, not power. When he reached Elis, the sight was more repulsive than anything Heracles had ever seen. Elis, once fertile lands, had turned into a brown, muddy swamp. The stables stood like a colossal monument, the kingdom of stench and filth. The smell hanging in the air was so heavy, it seemed to seep even through the hide of Heracles' lion skin. Heracles arrived at the palace of King Augean. King Augean greeted Heracles with an arrogant and astonished demeanor. He could not believe that the son of Zeus would accept such a repulsive task. The king looked at Heracles, a mocking expression on his face, clearly indicating his disbelief that a hero would come to clean his stables. However, since Eurystheus had sent him, Augean offered him a bargain. With a stiff expression, he stated that if Heracles could clean the stables in a single day, he would give him 1/10 of his herd, but if he failed, he would keep him as a slave. Heracles accepted the offer. He had to fulfill Eurystheus's command and break Augeas's pride. However, Heracles emphasized that this agreement was between himself and Augean, independent of Eurystheus's orders. Through this task, he sought not only his penance, but also his due. Augeas's son, Phileus, who was bothered by his father's arrogant and mocking attitude, witnessed this agreement. Heracles approached the stables. The doors were almost sealed shut by 30 years of dried dung and filth. He could have opened the doors with brute force, but that would only cause the muddy mountain of waste to collapse. Cleaning would still be impossible. Heracles did not even consider climbing over the filth or using a shovel. He was a hero, not a cleaner. This task had to be solved with creativity and the power of nature. Heracles began to examine the structure of the stables and the surrounding geography. The stables were located on a slight incline of the plain of Elis. Close to the stables, the region's 2 major rivers, the Alpheus and the Penance, flowed. These rivers gave life to the region, but were also the key to Heracles' plan. A brilliant engineering plan came to his mind. Why should he clean the mountain of filth with his own strength when he could use the power of nature? Heracles immediately set to work. Using his colossal club like a shovel, he began digging 2 large trenches around the stables. These trenches were designed to connect the Alpheus and Penance rivers at a point behind the stables. The trench digging required all of Heracles' strength. The ground was dry and hard, but Heracles' muscles swelled with the power of the Titans. His lion hide was soaked with sweat. He dug tirelessly for hours with unyielding determination. The look on his face was not the exhaustion of a slave, but the resolve of an architect. The trenches finally reached the riverbeds. Heracles now had to deliver the final blow that would shift the balance of nature. He used enormous boulders, just as he had sealed the entrance to Pholos's cave, to block the natural flow of the rivers. The rocks changed the riverbeds. Heracles made large openings in the stable walls for the water to flow in. And then Heracles released the flow of the rivers. The waters of the Alpheus and Penance surged into the open trenches in a massive wave. The water rapidly rose, gushing through the openings into the stables. Nature's greatest cleaning force was now washing away Augeas' 30 years of filth. The river waters created a massive vortex inside the stables. The 30 years of accumulated filth instantly began to dissolve. Thick, dried layers of excrement were torn away by the force of the water, separating from the walls and floors. The stench intensified for a moment, but it was temporary. The water carried the dirty current through the stables and out through the other trenches Heracles had dug toward the plain of Elis. Within a few hours, the stables were completely cleansed of 30 years of accumulated filth. As the sun set, Heracles stood inside the stables. The floor, for the first time in 30 years, was clean, dry, and sandy. The walls looked as if they had been newly built. The lands around the stables had also been washed clean by the river's current. Heracles had completed the task in a single day, without using a shovel or touching the filth. He had foiled Eurystheus' plan of humiliation with a brilliant engineering strategy. The people of Elis witnessed this miracle. Their foul-smelling lands were suddenly clean. Heracles was seen not as a servant but as a savior. Heracles returned to King Augeas' palace. When the king saw that the stables were cleaned, he felt first astonishment, then great anger. Heracles' ingenious solution had shattered his pride. Augeas immediately denied his promise, shouting that it was a trick and that Heracles had not dirtied his hands but used the power of the river. He stated he would not count this as fair cleaning and would not give him 1/10 of the herd, forcing the hero to leave. Heracles struggled to control his rage. He had not only completed the task, but had also made a bargain. Just then, Phyleus, the son of Augeas, who could not tolerate his father's injustice and arrogance, stepped forward. He told his father he must be honest, confirming that Heracles had successfully completed the task, finished the cleaning in a single day, and that this fully complied with the king's conditions, demanding he keep his oath. King Augeas grew even angrier at his son's honesty, rose from his throne, and instantly sentenced both Heracles and his son to exile. He claimed his son had shamed him and that Heracles had tried to steal his fortune, ordering both of them to be immediately driven from Elis. Heracles was once again confronted with honesty and injustice. He accepted silently. His duty was to fulfill Eurystheus' command. Heracles returned to Mycenae and announced his victory to Eurystheus. When Eurystheus heard that Augeas' stables had been cleaned, he frothed with fear and anger, but he learned that Heracles had performed the task for a reward. Copreus conveyed Eurystheus' command, stating that the king would not count this labor either. When Heracles asked why, Copreus explained, that because Heracles had performed the task solely for the reward of 1/10 of Augeas's cattle, the king viewed him not as a hero but as a mercenary. Eurystheus declared that his slave could not work for his own gain. This was Eurystheus's second refusal, the first being the Hydra labor. Since Eurystheus expected Heracles to complete only 10 labors, these two rejections meant Heracles would have to complete a total of 12 tasks. Heracles knew that this was the only way Eurystheus could condemn him to death or drag him into eternal slavery. Heracles simply nodded. He would take his revenge on Augeas in later years. Indeed, years after completing his penance, Heracles would return to Elis, kill Augeas and place Phyleus on the throne. For now the 5th trial was complete. Heracles had proven the power of intellect and strategy, not brute force. He had overcome the humiliation and filth with the power of nature. However, seeing that he could not defeat the hero's mind and patience, Eurystheus would send him back into a bloody war. The 6th labor would pit Heracles against the most terrifying, most venomous birds of the sky and earth, the Stymphalian Birds. The heart is a hero's shield, but sometimes a hero's strongest weapon is a sound from the heavens. The degrading filth of the 5th labor had been washed away from Heracles' hands by the power of rivers, but the jealousy of Eurystheus was not cleansed from his soul. Peering from the depths of his bronze jar, the king had seen that Heracles could solve his tasks cleverly, no matter how much he was humiliated, and now resolved to send him a danger that wit, strength, and honor alone could not conquer. The herald Coprius, departing from Mycenae this time, carried not only fear but also a mixture of disgust and despair. With a strong conviction that Heracles would finally be defeated, he relayed the king's order, declaring that Eurystheus commanded him to drive away and destroy the terrifying birds nested in the Stymphalian lake of Arcadia, insisting that these creatures were a plague, that they rained death from the air, and that Heracles must banish them from those lands forever. This task differed greatly from the monsters Heracles had faced before. The Nemean Lion was singular. The Hydra's heads could be counted, and the wild boar was a matter of sheer determination, but the Stymphalian birds were countless. They were not an individual terror, but a chaotic collective destruction. These birds did not merely hunt, but also poisoned all life around Lake Stymphalos, devastating orchards and fields. Furthermore, they ate the local people, which made them not just monsters, but hungry monsters. Their most dreadful feature was their bronze talons, bronze beaks, and most importantly, sharp bronze feathers that could be launched like arrows. As they flew, they could shoot their feathers toward their targets like a shower of missiles, a weapon capable of defeating an army single-handedly. Eurystheus's goal was clear. He hoped Heracles would be unable to withstand the bronze arrow storm of a massive flock of birds and would be torn to pieces at the task site. Heracles tightened his lion skin and understood that this labor could not be solved by sheer force, as this was an army in the sky, constantly moving, shooting feathers like arrows, and the battle required movement, speed, and strategy. His journey led him toward the high mountains of Arcadia, and as he neared Lake Stymphalos, the air began to change. The mountaintops were enveloped by dark, leaden clouds surrounding the lake. The lake itself was shallow, swampy, and covered with thick vegetation, but the most striking thing was the poisonous silence. While a lakeshore is usually filled with the sounds of birds, frogs, and the wind, at Stymphalos it was as if death itself hung over the lake. When Heracles reached the lakeshore, the landscape was bleak. The shoreline was covered with heaps of white bones picked clean by the birds. The trees were white with bird droppings, and everywhere there were thick, sharp feathers tinged with bronze. The birds' nests were in the swampy area at the center of the lake, amidst dense and impenetrable reeds and trees. Heracles knew that if he attempted to approach them, the soft ground would pull him into the mire, and the birds would comfortably pierce him with their bronze feathers from above. Standing on the shore, Heracles realized his bow and hydra venom-coated arrows could not contend with so many enemies, making it a complete deadlock. In despair, Heracles looked up at the sky. Though he was the son of a god, he saw the limits of his own strength, and this moment tested not his power, but the confidence placed in his benevolence and respect for the gods. Just then, a delicate yet echoing voice came from behind him, and the goddess Athena bade him halt. When Heracles turned around, he saw Athena, goddess of wisdom, war, and strategy, in astonishing splendor. With her helmet, spear, and shield, she had come to assist Heracles in his most difficult moment. Athena approached him, respect for Heracles' clever solutions visible on her face. She said that Eurystheus had realized he could not defeat his strength, and that these birds were an enemy to be countered not by physical power, but by intellect and sound. Athena displayed 2 large bronze crotala, clappers, forged by Hephaestus' own hands, explaining that these were her gift to him, that he should strike the clappers, whose sound would drown out the terrifying noise of the birds and flush them out of the swampy trees where they hid into the air. This was a brilliant strategy by which Heracles could draw the birds into the sky, the range of his own weapons, his arrows. Heracles bowed to Athena in gratitude, telling the goddess she had provided him with greater aid than his warrior's strength. Athena smiled and warned Heracles to move quickly, as the sound of the crotala would only halt their attack for a short time. The goddess vanished in a flash of light. Heracles was now alone, holding the Nemean Lion's skin, the Hydra's poisoned arrows, and the crotala of the goddess Athena. Heracles took Athena's crotala. The bronze clappers carried a divine weight and vibration even in his hand. He climbed a high cliff at the edge of the lake, directly opposite the swampy area where the birds nested. Heracles raised the crotala above his head and began to strike them with all his might. Clang, clang, clang. The sound was not merely loud, but possessed a supernatural vibration. It was the ring of Hephaestus' forge, an echo of the god's wrath, and the poisonous silence over the lake shattered instantly. The sound of the crotala reached deep into the swamp and forest, every corner where the birds nested. The birds perceived this noise not as the cry of a predator, but as the sound of destruction, and they panicked. From the swamp trees where they nested, first a few, then thousands, began to rise in a horrific bronze flock. The sky suddenly darkened, and the Stymphalian birds, with their massive wings, began to circle over the lake like a cloud of bronze armor, immediately heading toward Heracles, eager to take vengeance and silence the noise. Heracles swiftly dropped the crotala and prepared his bow and arrows. To defend themselves, the birds began to launch their bronze feathers toward Heracles like a shower of arrows. The feathers split the air with whistling sounds, raining down upon him. Heracles quickly sheltered behind the Nemean Lion's skin. The hide, which even the sharpest weapons on earth could not pierce, repelled the bronze feathers, which crashed against it with metallic sounds and bounced back into the air. The hide was once again the invincible shield that saved Heracles' life. The bird's first attack was repelled. Now it was Heracles' turn. Heracles drew his bow. His arrows were coated with the deadliest venom of the Lernaean Hydra, and a single hit meant the end of a bird. Heracles aimed at the birds, which had been raised into the air by the sound of the clappers, and fired his arrows strategically one by one rather than toward the enemy mass. Hiss, hiss, hiss. Heracles' bow worked like a machine gun, and every arrow he fired instantly poisoned a bird in mid-air. A literal rain of bronze birds began over the lake. The birds screamed in confusion and terror, for they had neither seen such an arrow storm nor faced such a swift and precise hunter. Heracles continued to shoot arrows tirelessly. He aimed for the most crowded spots of the flock, creating chaos and panic. Finally, the flock realized they were fighting against an invincible power. The remaining birds all together ascended into the sky in fear and panic, flying out of Heracles' range, beyond the borders of Arcadia and Greece, toward the Black Sea, Caradenes. Legends say they settled there, and these horrific birds later posed a problem for sailors, such as the Argonauts, on their journeys. Heracles watched the last bird disappear into the sky, put his bow and arrows back in their quiver, and struck the Crotala one last time, purely as a declaration of victory. The lake was silent again, but this time it was not a poisonous silence, but a peaceful tranquility. The Stymphalian birds were gone, and Heracles had completed his task. When he returned to Mycenae, even Copreus hesitated to approach Heracles' bloodied armor and tired but triumphant face. And when Eurystheus heard that the birds had been destroyed, he was filled with anger and disappointment. Yet Eurystheus was forced to accept this labor, as Athena's aid was not a sufficient reason to disregard the royal command. However, Heracles knew that two of his tasks, the Hydra and the Augean Stables, had been rejected, meaning he still had 7 labors to complete. Eurystheus acknowledged that Heracles had successfully completed 6 tasks and announced the next one. The 7th labor would be the Cretan bull, the cursed bull of King Minos, which Zeus himself had been involved with. This time Heracles would have to use his strength against the uncontrollable rage of a divine animal. Anger is like the breath of a chained titan. Once freed, it can shake the earth. Heracles had driven the terror of the Stymphalian birds toward the Black Sea and successfully completed 6 labors, excluding the 2 tasks Eurystheus rejected. King Eurystheus realized that it was pointless to keep Heracles busy with monsters within the borders of Hellas, Greece. For this reason, he decided to send the hero beyond the known world to the strongest and most mystic island in the Aegean Sea, Crete. The herald Copreus, trembling this time at the sheer magnitude of the distance on the map, announced the 7th labor, stating that Eurystheus commanded him to capture the fierce bull on the island of Crete and bring it to Mycenae before the king. Copreus added that this bull was not only powerful, but also a cursed animal, that it was destroying the island's fields, people, and flocks, and that the king wished to see it chained and subdued. This task was unlike anything Heracles had faced before. The Nemean Lion was a monster, but this carried the fury of a divine animal. The story of the Cretan bull stemmed from the arrogance of King Minos. Minos had asked Poseidon for a sign from the sea to prove his power. The sea god, granting Minos' request, had sent a colossal bull of breathtaking, pure white beauty from the waves. Minos was supposed to sacrifice this bull to Poseidon. However, Minos could not resist the bull's beauty, added it to his own herd, and sacrificed a common bull in its place. Poseidon's wrath was inevitable. To punish Minos, the god drove the bull mad, transforming it into the wildest, most destructive creature on Crete. This bull roamed freely on the western tip of the island, starting fires, trampling fields, and destroying everything in its path. This was not just an animal, but the physical embodiment of divine vengeance. Eurystheus's plan was either to ensure Heracles was crushed beneath the horns of this enraged bull, or to hope that Minos would not allow the bull to be taken from Crete, which would mean the failure of the labor. Heracles had to cross the fierce waters of the Aegean Sea as he embarked on his sea voyage to this cursed island. He boarded a simple ship and sailed from the shores of Greece south toward Crete, the magnificent and cursed kingdom of Minos. The sea journey was long and arduous. The sun scorched the lion skin draped over Heracles, but the warmth of the hide tested the hero's endurance. During his days at sea, Heracles listened to the stories of Minos's arrogance and Poseidon's fury. Crete, once a center of wealth and civilization, now lived under the shadow of that cursed bull. Upon arriving in Crete, Heracles advanced from the western shores of the island toward the area where the bull roamed freely, marked by devastated fields and burned forests. There was a strange smell in the air: sea salt, burnt grass, and the odor of wild, uncontrollable rage. Heracles had to find the bull's lair before visiting Minos's palace. King Minos already wanted to be rid of this bull, but capturing it was impossible. The bull's tracks were colossal. Even next to Heracles' giant footprints, the bull's hooves had torn up the rock-hard ground. After a while, Heracles heard a wild roar in the distance. This was not the sound of an ordinary animal. It was the sound of Poseidon's power and fury coming from the depths of the water. The hero temporarily stopped searching for the bull to complete his task and protect his honor, and set off for the palace of Knossos, the heart of Crete. King Minos received Heracles with great splendor. Minos had heard of Heracles' reputation, the hero who had overcome the Nemean Lion and conquered the Hydra. Minos also knew that Heracles was a slave, and that this was an opportunity to be rid of the bull's curse. Sitting in the marble hall of his palace, Minos addressed Heracles, asking if his arrival was a light of hope for the island, confirming that the bull was Poseidon's wrath, that they had been unable to capture or kill it, and asking if his intention was to take it to Eurystheus in Mycenae. Heracles nodded inside his lion skin, stating that this was part of his atonement, but that he had to ask permission as the bull belonged to the king's realm. Minos smiled, a proud and mocking smile, granting Heracles permission and even encouragement, saying that if he could capture it, he could banish the bull from Crete forever, and the island would be happy to be rid of this curse, promising he would place no obstacles in his way. Minos' approval was a great advantage for Heracles. Minos believed the bull was impossible to catch, so he had nothing to lose. With permission secured from Minos, Heracles returned to the mountains to face the bull carrying Poseidon's wrath. He tracked the bull. Finally, he found it in the depths of a valley. The Cretan bull was far more magnificent than Minos had described. It shone pure white like marble, but madness and divine fury burned in its eyes. It had a massive body, twice the size of the Nemean Lion, and the breath from its nostrils was like a cold winter wind. The ground trembled with every strike of the bull's hooves. The bull saw Heracles. It did not see a hunter, but the arrogance of Minos who had imprisoned it. Without a moment's hesitation, the bull charged toward Heracles, gigantic horns leading the way. This was the purest battle of strength he had ever encountered. The bull was filled not just with muscle, but with Poseidon's oceanic energy. The bull struck Heracles. The force of the impact caused even Heracles to stagger back a few meters, despite the protection of the lion skin. Heracles planted his feet firmly on the ground. The horns scraped against the thick hide of the lion skin, but failed to pierce it. Heracles gathered his strength and parried the bull's attack. He was not merely fighting, but using strategic movements to exhaust the bull. In a struggle that could be called the dance of power, Heracles fought the bull in the open field like a gladiator. The bull's strength was equal to Heracles' own, but Heracles possessed intelligence and agility. The bull roared in fury and attacked again. Heracles dodged sideways at the last moment. This caused the bull to expend its energy uselessly. Heracles seized the opportunity and grabbed one of the bull's horns. It was a momentary grip. The bull shook its head violently. Even with his enormous strength, Heracles struggled to pin the bull's head to the ground. The horns slipped from Heracles' hands. Heracles used his other arm and grabbed the bull's second horn as well. Now Heracles and the bull were engaged in a colossal tug-of-war. The bull thrashed with all the power of Poseidon. Heracles resisted with all the power of Zeus. The ground cracked beneath this struggle of strength. Neither could take a step back nor a step forward. This was the moment of two divine forces fighting for control of a mortal land. Heracles felt himself starting to tire, but he did not give up. He remembered the grief of Pholos, his mother's curse, and the humiliation of Eurystheus. This was not just a task, but a fight to control his own destiny. With one last titanic effort, Heracles threw his weight onto the bull. The bull's neck began to bend under Heracles' power. Finally, the bull's forelegs could not withstand Heracles' sheer strength, and the bull knelt on the ground. The bull was defeated. It was vanquished in a moment where power met power, but divine strength controlled divine fury. Heracles did not let go of the bull's horns. He moved quickly and tied the bull's strong legs with the thick, sturdy, and non-hydra poison-coated ropes he had brought. The bull struggled, but the ropes were cast with Heracles' strength. They were impossible to untie. In the second journey after capturing the bull, Heracles found a unique method to take it to Mycenae. The bull was too wild to be transported by ship, and taking it by land was impossible because of the divine strength it still possessed. Heracles jumped onto the bull's back. Although the bull was still roaring wildly, it could not move due to Heracles' weight and control, combined with the horns and the ropes securing its legs. Heracles tied the bull's ropes to himself and dragged it toward the Augean Sea, commencing an incredible swim across the sea from Crete to Mycenae. Riding on the bull's back like a mariner, Heracles began to cross the fierce waters of the Aegean. The bull thrashed even in the cold waters of the sea, but Heracles' strength and control steered it in the right direction. This journey lasted for weeks. Heracles overcame the bull's roar and Poseidon's waves. He was controlling not only the bull, but also the power of the seas. Finally, Heracles and the bull reached the shores of the Peloponnese. When the bull came ashore, it was exhausted but still wild. The moment Heracles stood before the terrified Eurystheus, he dragged the Cretan bull toward Mycenae by its ropes, instead of carrying it on his shoulders. As they approached Mycenae, King Eurystheus witnessed the spectacle. He saw Heracles dragging Poseidon's furious bull, which even Minos could not control, like a pet. The fear at the bottom of Eurystheus's bronze jar now reached its peak. The king wanted to add this bull to his herd. He desired the power of this divine animal, but he was so afraid of Heracles' presence that he could not take the bull from Heracles' hand and chain it. Heracles brought the bull into the square of Mycenae. The bull roared. The sound echoed off the city walls. Heracles released the bull's ropes and informed the king that the task of the Cretan bull was completed. Eurystheus did not dare to keep this bull. The bull still carried divine rage, and the same fate that befell Minos could befall Eurystheus. From inside his jar, Eurystheus whispered to Copreus to immediately release it, and stated that this animal could not belong to Mycenae. Heracles smiled. That was his intention all along. As soon as the bull was released, it fled from Mycenae. It ran outside Eurystheus's kingdom toward the plain of Marathon. There it would terrorize the region for years and would eventually be killed by the Athenian hero Theseus. The seventh labor was complete. Heracles had both saved Crete from Minos's curse and proved his ability to control the power of Poseidon. Eurystheus had seen that Heracles' strength could cope not only with monsters, but also with divine vengeance itself. The eighth labor would send Heracles to the purest form of death and savagery. Eurystheus would task Heracles with capturing the man-eating Mares of Diomedes, the savage king of Thrace. Barbarity sometimes wears a noble crown, but true nobility means not losing mercy, even in the face of the wildest duties. 7 great trials had proven the strength, intellect, patience, and cunning of Heracles. King Eurystheus now had to send this unconquered hero to the most savage, most primitive, and most terrifying corner of the known world, hoping Heracles would this time be struck with dread in the face of pure horror. The herald Copreus, emerging this time outside the walls of Mycenae, stood before Heracles. His voice was not trembling or timid, but filled with the disgust born from the tales of Thrace's barbaric lands. Copreus announced the 8th labor, informing Heracles that Eurystheus commanded him to steal the 4 man-eating mares of Diomedes, the savage king of Thrace. The hero was required to capture and contain them and bring them to Mycenae, delivered and chained before the king. Copreus emphasized that they were not ordinary horses, but the 4 legs of death. This task brought with it a moral dilemma for Heracles, for while previous monsters were creatures of nature or the gods, these mares were the product of a human, a king's uncontrolled savagery. Diomedes was the son of Ares, the god of war, and the king of the Bistones, the most barbaric tribe of Thrace. His wealth came from his wild herd of horses. These mares were not fed ordinary fodder. Diomedes fed them with foreigners and captives taken in war. Even the names of these mares reflected their savagery: Podargos, swift; Lampon, shining; Xanthos, yellow; and Deinos, terrifying. The eyes of these mares constantly burned with a search for blood, and their muscles swelled with pure ferocity, their neigh being not just the sound of a horse, but the roar of a hungry beast. Eurystheus hoped these horses would overcome Heracles more easily than the Cretan bull, for they were not only powerful, but also intelligent and addicted to blood. Heracles approached this savage task with greater seriousness than the others. knowing that capturing the horses required not just physical power, but also mental control. He was not alone on this journey, for he knew he needed an assistant to complete the task, and he took with him a young, handsome, and brave friend named Abderus, one of Heracles' most loyal companions, for whom his affection was great. Heracles and Abderus crossed the Aegean Sea and reached the coarse and cold shores of Thrace, where Diomedes' kingdom lay on the coastline, in the heart of barbarity. As they approached the shore, even the sea breeze carried a heavy smell of flesh and blood, and the lands around the kingdom were covered with wild grasses and muddy swamps, a reflection of the horses' habitat. Diomedes' stables were not like ordinary barns. They were fortified like a prison, surrounded by high walls, iron bars, and thick chains, with piles of bones and dried bloodstains scattered around. It was not an animal shelter, but a slaughterhouse. Heracles devised a plan to infiltrate King Diomedes' palace and create chaos before approaching the stables. And together with Abderus, they entered the palace disguised as foreign merchants. Diomedes was hospitable toward foreigners, for every foreigner meant new feed for his horses, and his eyes were constantly fixed on Heracles and Abderus. The king's face was hard, coarse, and expressed a continuous search for blood. During the feast, Heracles sought an opportunity to provoke the king's hubris. Diomedes began to boast about the strength of his horses and the feed they consumed, roaring that his mares only ate the flesh of the noblest, bravest enemies, that their blood gave them greater strength than even the bull of Poseidon, and that no one could take them or master them. Heracles stood up, still wearing the Nemean Lion's hide, and in a loud and authoritative tone, he told King Diomedes that his horses were merely a reflection of his barbarism, and that true strength lay not in a hero's brute force, but in mercy and control, declaring that the king's horses would be condemned to eat more than the flesh of foreigners they consumed in a single day. Diomedes was enraged by this challenge, shouting back at Heracles that he was that cursed slave of Eurystheus, and that his horses would tear him to pieces and eat even his bones. A fight immediately broke out between Diomedes and Heracles used his massive club to instantly strike down the guards, seizing and throwing Diomedes to the ground. This chaos was the first step in Heracles' plan. Taking advantage of the turmoil in the palace, Heracles ran toward the horses' stables with his loyal friend Abderus and tore the massive iron doors from their hinges with brute force. The four mares, Podargos, Lampon, Xanthos, and Dinos, were suddenly freed, went wild, and immediately began attacking the nearest targets, the king's guards. Heracles' plan was to surprise the horses and satisfy their initial hunger before trying to control them. This ruthless strategy created the momentary chaos Heracles needed to capture the mares. While Heracles prepared the ropes and chains for the horses, he instructed Abderus to drive the horses toward the shore, to keep them near the sea, stating that they could not be controlled until he neutralized Diomedes. Abderus trembled with fear, but his loyalty to Heracles overcame his terror, and he plunged among the four wild horses, beginning to drive them toward the shore. Heracles immediately returned. King Diomedes had recovered and was attacking Heracles. Heracles struck Diomedes one more time and seized him, knowing that in this labor he had to destroy not only the horses' savagery, but also the source of that savagery. Heracles dragged Diomedes toward his horses, a moment of Heracles' merciless justice, and announced to King Diomedes that his horses would eat their master. Heracles hurled Diomedes before his horses and the mares stopped instantly. Their eyes grew even wilder at the scent of their own master, and they immediately fell upon Diomedes, tearing him apart with savage hunger. Diomedes' consumption briefly satisfied and surprised the horses, their savage nature momentarily subdued by the flesh of their own master. And this was the only moment Heracles needed to gain control of the horses. Heracles immediately ran toward the shore. Although the horses had eaten their master, their ferocity had not completely subsided. When he reached the shore, the sight that greeted him broke Heracles' heart. The 4 mares stood by the sea, their mouths bloody, but Abderus lay lifeless on the ground. The mares had torn apart and devoured Abderus during the brief moment Heracles was away, and Abderus's courage and loyalty had been sacrificed to the mares' hunger. Heracles was devastated, seeing once again after the death of his own family that his curse had taken an innocent victim. His grief instantly turned into pure rage. Heracles leapt onto the 4 horses, using his brute force to grab the mares by their powerful legs. The horses struggled and roared, but Heracles' rage was greater than their savagery. Heracles pressed the horses down with his shoulders and tied thick, sturdy, sea-soaked ropes he had brought with him around their necks. The mares struggled helplessly, but Heracles' power pinned them to the ground. Although they were briefly sated by Diomedes' flesh, Heracles' grief and anger brought even their spirits to their knees. They were now under control. Heracles had completed his labor, but there was no taste of victory, and he took Abderus' lifeless body into his arms. Heracles arranged a funeral befitting a hero for his friend Abderus, chaining the mares for a short while longer, and honored Abderus by founding a city named Abdera on the seashore where he was slain, a city that would forever remain a symbol of Heracles' grief and friendship. After completing this mourning and the monument, Heracles set off to take the mares to Mycenae. The journey was difficult, and the mares were still wild and hard to control, but they were held firm by Heracles' unwavering command, who controlled the mares while carrying the memory of Abderus in his mind. He had now paid the price of his strength and his curse with one of his dearest companions. When Heracles brought the man-eating mares to Mycenae, King Eurystheus' reaction was different from the other labors, showing that his fear had turned into horror at the fact that Heracles had not only captured them, but brought them under control. And seeing the mares' blood-seeking eyes, the king once again hid deep within his bronze jar. He did not dare to bring these horses into his own stable and issued his command through a trembling Copreus, ordering Heracles to remove these beasts from Mycenae because they carried Heracles' power, and to sacrifice them to the lofty gods of Olympus. Heracles carried out the order, and the mares were sacrificed by Eurystheus' command. However, the horses were not accepted even by the gods, and their savage spirits ascended toward the sky and mingled with the wild spirits of nature. According to one rumor, the wild horses descended from these mares would continue to roam that region for years afterward. The 8th labor was complete. Heracles had defeated not only a monster, but also the barbarism of a king. Yet the price of his victory was the tragic death of Abderus. Eurystheus realized that Heracles' power and grief made him invincible, and decided that the next task would test Heracles not only by his strength, but also by diplomacy and feminine wiles. The 9th labor, the Belt of Hippolyte, queen of the Amazons. This would lead Heracles to the kingdom of warrior women on the distant shores of Asia, a saga of heroism and misunderstanding. Respect is stronger than a hero's shield, but misunderstanding can turn even the best intentions into a clash of swords. Heracles was carrying the bitter burden of 8 trials. Abderus's death had opened a deep wound in his mind, constantly reminding him of the severe consequences of brute force. King Eurystheus designed this new labor to emotionally exhaust Heracles, forcing him to walk the fine line between logic and emotion. When the herald Copreus appeared before Heracles this time, his voice was not filled with the fear of past tasks, but a mixture of curiosity and astonishment. Copreus announced the 9th labor, proclaiming that Eurystheus commanded Heracles to retrieve the Belt of Hippolyte, queen of the Amazons, a belt given to her by Ares, the god of war, symbolizing martial power and womanhood, and to bring it to Mycenae at all costs, as the king desired his daughter Admete, according to some accounts, to possess it. This task posed an entirely different kind of danger, for the Amazons were a nation comprised solely of warrior women, rejecting male dominance. Their kingdom was situated on the southern shores of the Black Sea, around the Thermodon River. They were as skilled as any Greek warrior, superior in mounted combat and relentless. Defeating them with brute force alone would challenge even the entirety of Heracles' strength. The belt itself was no ordinary garment. It was Ares' gift, a symbol of Hippolyte being the greatest queen of the Amazons, and it represented the queen's power, authority, and warrior virtue. Taking this belt was an assault on the national pride of the Amazons. Eurystheus's plan hoped that Heracles would either fail to find a diplomatic solution with the Amazons and be forced into a deadly war, or commit a moral error while taking the belt. Heracles knew the difficulty of this task. He had defeated the man-eating horses of Thrace alone, but he needed help to overcome an army of warrior women. Therefore, Heracles gathered a group of volunteer heroes from all over Greece. This was the first time on Heracles' path of atonement that he acted with a great spirit of companionship. He took with him the bravest warriors of the time, such as Iolaus, his nephew, Telamon, king of Salamis, and Peleus, father of Achilles. They set sail on a sturdy ship, crossing the Aegean Sea and the Hellespont toward the harsh waters of the Black Sea, Pontus Euxinus. The journey was both long and difficult, as the waves of the Black Sea were much fiercer and more unpredictable than those of the Aegean. Along the way, Heracles and his companions stopped at the island of Tenedos, where Heracles was forced to kill Sarpedon, the island's king, for his rough conduct toward his comrades, in order to protect their honor. This was a sign that Heracles always remembered that the rule of heroism was to secure justice, and brute force was merely a means. Finally, the ship reached the shores of the Black Sea, arriving at the mouth of the Thermodon River, at Themyscira, the capital of the Amazons. The landscape was different from what was expected, as the city was surrounded by high walls and impressive architecture, indicating that it was not a barbaric tribe, but a settled and powerful nation. Heracles anchored the ship on the bank of the Thermodon River. The bitter experiences of previous labors had taught him that diplomacy was the best course, and thus he did not want to initiate a war immediately. Alone, wearing his lion's hide, with his bow and club in hand, he walked toward the city to appear before Queen Hippolyte, instructing his warriors to wait on the ship. Queen Hippolyte received Heracles in her palace. The queen's appearance impressed even Heracles. She was not only a beautiful woman, but also a strong and determined warrior. She wore the dazzling belt Ares had given her, embroidered with gold and precious stones, which sat on Hippolyte's body like armor. Hippolyte approached Heracles with respect, having heard of his fame and considering his arrival an honor for the Amazons. The queen, her voice both authoritative and gentle, asked Heracles if the purpose of his journey to her kingdom from such a distant land was war or peace. Heracles bowed, saying he was not a warrior, but a man seeking atonement, a slave of Eurystheus whose duty was to take the belt gifted by Ares, but that he did not wish to wage war, and pleaded for her to give the belt in exchange for honor. Queen Hippolyte was impressed by Heracles' honesty and humility, appreciating his diplomatic approach rather than his brute force. Hippolyte took a deep breath, stating that the belt was the symbol of her own power, and that losing it could damage the honor of the Amazons, yet she understood Heracles' difficult situation and respected his honor. And noting that the completion of a hero's atonement was important for all of Hellas, she announced that she would willingly give him the belt. Heracles was filled with astonishment and gratitude, having won a victory with peace and respect that he might have otherwise had to win with brute force. Just as he was about to take the belt, the curse of Olympus intervened. Heracles' easy victory angered Hera, the queen of the gods. Hera did not want Heracles to complete his atonement and progress toward immortality, so she put her most insidious plan into action to sabotage his success. Hera immediately took the guise of an Amazon warrior, quickly blending into the Amazon army and spreading among the queen's most trusted warriors. With a cunning and venomous whisper, Hera spread the lie among the Amazons that Heracles had come to kidnap and enslave Queen Hippolyte, claiming the belt was merely a pretext, and inciting them to save the honor of the warrior women. When the Amazon army heard this lie, they were instantly filled with panic and fury, for they had fought against male dominance for thousands of years, and this was their greatest fear: the kidnapping of their queen and the humiliation of their nation. Hera quickly moved toward the shore where the ships were anchored and incited the Amazons against Heracles' friends. Heracles was about to take the belt from Queen Hippolyte's hand when war cries were heard from outside. Queen Hippolyte quickly looked out the window and saw the Amazon army attacking Heracles' ship. Hippolyte tried to understand what was happening, but Heracles' friends were already returning the Amazon attack. The Amazons attacked in perfect battle formation on horseback, with their bows and axes, their arrows darkening the air. Although Heracles' friends were heroes, they were astonished by the disciplined and ferocious assault of the Amazons. When Heracles saw this sudden chaos, he failed to comprehend Hera's trick. He only believed he had been terribly betrayed, thinking Hippolyte had stalled him and trapped his friends. The bitter memory of Abderus momentarily overshadowed Heracles' reason, and he once again succumbed to his rage. Heracles roared at the queen wearing Ares' belt that she had betrayed him, stalled him, and trapped his friends. Heracles quickly drew his sword from its sheath, believing the only way to end the confusion was to eliminate the leader. Queen Hippolyte was filled with astonishment and horror. She understood Heracles' intention, but before she could defend herself, she was helpless against his titanic strength. Without hesitation, Heracles killed Queen Hippolyte in the midst of the chaos. This was a momentary tragic mistake. Heracles was forced to take the belt with bloodshed, a victim of misunderstanding and Hera's provocation, a belt he could have received peacefully. Queen Hippolyte's death changed the course of the war. When the Amazons saw their queen slain, they were momentarily shaken with horror and despair. Heracles quickly removed the belt from Hippolyte's lifeless body. The belt was cold and heavy in Heracles' hand. He carried not a trophy of victory, but a monument to regret. Melanippe, Hippolyte's second-in-command, immediately attacked Heracles for revenge. However, though his rage had subsided, Heracles was still invincible. He captured Melanippe and took her prisoner. This completely demoralized the Amazon army. Their queen was dead, and their second-in-command was captured. Holding Melanippe hostage, Heracles made a pact with the Amazon army, telling the warrior women, his voice tired but determined, that the death of their queen was the result of a misunderstanding and that he did not wish to fight them. He further stated that if they wanted their second-in-command Melanippe back, they should allow him to take the belt and depart. The Amazons, mourning their queen, were forced to accept this as a last resort. They promised Heracles to retreat and allow his ship safe passage in exchange for Melanippe's release. Heracles kept his word and released Melanippe. Melanippe looked at Heracles with gratitude, for Heracles had made an honorable agreement instead of killing her. Thus Heracles obtained Ares' belt at the cost of a bloody victory and a tragic regret. Heracles and his companions quickly departed from the Amazon lands. The return journey was filled with sorrow and silence in the stormy waters of the Black Sea. Heracles felt immense remorse for killing Hippolyte. He had seen once again how his curse could poison even his best intentions. Upon returning to Greece, Heracles went to Mycenae with the belt and delivered it to King Eurystheus. Eurystheus rejoiced upon seeing Ares' belt and gave it to his daughter Admete. The king knew Heracles had completed the labor with blood, not diplomacy, and this secretly delighted him because it deepened the pain in Heracles' soul. The 9th trial was complete. Heracles still had 3 labors to perform, as Eurystheus had not counted the Hydra and Augeas tasks. Eurystheus decided to send Heracles on the farthest, most exotic, and most legendary task yet. This task would challenge the boundaries of the world. The 10th labor, the Cattle of Geryon. Heracles had to cross the ocean, travel to the land of Atlas's pillars, defeat the 3-bodied giant Geryon, and bring his colossal herd of cattle to Mycenae. This would be Heracles' longest, most difficult and most fantastic adventure yet. The end of the world is not just a geography, but the deepest boundary of the soul. Heroism is crossing beyond that end. 9 labors had taken Heracles from the borders of Hellas to the barbarism of Thrace and the wild coasts of the Black Sea. But King Eurystheus still had not found the ultimate task Heracles could not accomplish. Every victory of Heracles only deepened the king's fear. Now, he was forced to send Heracles to the farthest point on earth, both geographically and mythologically. The herald Copreus this time drew Heracles' attention with the disbelief in his voice, even as he spoke the name of the task. Copreus announced the 10th labor, proclaiming that Eurystheus commanded Heracles to bring the cattle of Geryon from the mythical island of Erythea, beyond Oceanus at the western edge of the world. Copreus stated this was not merely a theft, but an impossible journey, adding that Heracles would have to go there, defeat the 3-bodied giant Geryon, and bring his colossal herd of red cattle back to Mycenae before the king. This task overshadowed everything Heracles had faced thus far, for Erythea, the Red Island, was in the Western Ocean, where the sun set and the night began. To reach it, Heracles had to cross the known seas, traverse the scorching deserts of Libya, and find the very edge of the world. Geryon was no ordinary giant. He was a terrifying triple-layered being with 6 arms, 6 legs, and 3 separate bodies joined at a single waist, and he was the protector of the cattle. His herd was guarded by Orthus, a 2-headed serpent-tailed dog, and Eurytion, a massive herdsman. The cattle themselves were not only vast in number, but also blood-red in color and possessed a warrior spirit. Eurystheus expected Heracles to either perish, lost on this journey, or fail to defeat this fantastic 3-bodied giant. Heracles knew this labor was more than just a sea voyage, and he left his companions behind. This adventure would seal the fate of a single hero with the most remote corner of the world. First, Heracles set out and advanced toward the western edge of the Mediterranean, reaching the coasts of the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, and Libya, North Africa. His journey passed through the hottest regions of the Mediterranean. Upon reaching Libya, the heat of Helios, the sun god, became unbearable. The air was like fire. The sun's rays scorched even the skin of Heracles' Nemean Lion hide. Heracles grew angry at this situation. In his pain and exhaustion, he notched an arrow to his bow and angrily aimed it at the sky, directly at the sun god Helios. This was a moment of Heracles' hubris and simultaneously his desperation. He possessed the strength to defeat all mortals and even some gods, but he could not withstand the fire of Helios in the sky. As Heracles was about to release the arrow, Helios looked down from the sky at Heracles. Instead of anger, the sun god felt admiration for Heracles' audacity and was astonished that a mortal would dare to challenge a god. Helios called out to Heracles, asking him to stop and state his intent, saying that mortal strength could not overcome his eternal fire. Heracles, trembling from exhaustion and rage, replied that god Helios's fire was scorching his path, that he had to go to the farthest corner of the world, and that if he could not complete this task, his curse would never end, begging for mercy to complete the journey. Helios smiled. He appreciated Heracles' determination and boldness, and presented Heracles with his own golden cup from the sky. This cup was the colossal golden vessel in which Helios sailed from east to west across the waters of Oceanus every night. Helios told Heracles to take the cup, saying it would help him cross the waters of the ocean, and that when night fell, the cup would carry him to the shores of Erythea. This demonstrated Heracles' ability to even befriend a god through his hubris. He set aside the arrow and accepted Helios's golden cup with gratitude. Even the divine aid received from Helios did not diminish the difficulty of Heracles' journey. Heracles reached the narrow strait known as the Pillars of Heracles, Strait of Gibraltar, where the Mediterranean and the ocean met. Here, Heracles wanted to leave a sign for future sailors and heroes, marking the place where the world ended. With enormous power, he erected 2 great peaks on both sides of the strait, on the coasts of Europe and Africa. These peaks would be known as the Pillars of Heracles from that day forth. These pillars became an eternal monument to Heracles' strength, marking the limit of the known world in the west and the beginning of the unknown beyond the ocean. After completing the pillars, Heracles jumped into the golden cup. As the sun set, Heracles, carried by the cup, sailed toward the cold and unknown waters of the ocean. Helios's cup protected Heracles even in the midst of a storm. He made a dark and fantastic journey through the waves, The waters of the ocean were filled with whispers of unknown monsters and legends. Finally, Heracles reached the island of Erythea at dawn. The island's name meant red. The setting sun painted the island in shades of crimson and gold. This was the edge of the world. The air was filled with a mystical twilight. Heracles brought the cup ashore and prayed to Helios to offer his gratitude. The landscape of the island was terrifying. The grasses were tinged red from the dung of the blood-red cattle. The air hung with salt seaweed and a heavy, wild animal scent. Heracles found the herd of cattle. The cattle numbered in the thousands, and each one possessed a deep, blood-red color. The area where they grazed was savage and desolate enough to frighten even the Gorgons. Heracles approached the cattle. Every single cow bore Geryon's seal. As he drew near the herd, a fierce growling suddenly rang out. First, Orthus attacked. This two-headed, serpent-tailed dog was more savage than even the Nemean Lion. Orthus's two heads roared simultaneously. Fire spewed from one mouth and poisonous spittle from the other. Heracles was quick. He had lost Abderus and Pholus. Therefore, he was determined to defeat the Guardian. Heracles used his massive club. As Orthus attacked with both heads at once, Heracles struck his club with lightning speed directly between Orthus's two heads. The force of the blow was like a titan's strike. Orthus's skulls were shattered in a single strike. The two-headed dog collapsed onto the ground with a moment of savage roar. Orthus's death immediately prompted the herdsman Eurytion into action. Eurytion was a colossal, thick-muscled herdsman. He ran toward Heracles with his club in hand. Eurytion was a giant, but Heracles was the son of Zeus. The battle between them was short. Heracles drew one of his arrows steeped in the venom of the Hydra. The arrow swiftly cut through the air and lodged in Eurytion's chest. The poison took effect instantly. Eurytion collapsed onto the ground with a momentary shriek of pain and died. Heracles had defeated both guardians of the cattle with speed and precision. He knew time was limited and had to take the cattle before Geryon learned what had happened. However, Heracles' success was witnessed by a herdsman in the farthest corner of Erythea. This herdsman immediately ran to Geryon and reported that the guardians had been killed. Geryon was coming. Geryon donned his armor. When his three bodies moved simultaneously, the ground trembled. He wore 3 helmets on his heads. His 6 arms held 6 shields and 6 spears. He was not just one warrior, but the sum of 3. Heracles saw Geryon's approach. This was the most fantastic foe he had ever faced. Geryon ran toward Heracles. His 3 heads roared simultaneously at Heracles. The battle began on the bank of the Antheus River. Geryon hurled his 6 spears at Heracles all at once. Heracles, under the protection of the Nemean Lion hide, fended off the attacks. But Geryon's power shook Heracles' shield with every spear strike. Heracles realized he could not defeat this 3-bodied giant in a traditional fight. He had to use his intelligence. Geryon, with his 3 bodies, was slow to move and maneuver. Heracles was agile. Heracles rapidly began circling Geryon. He had to focus on Geryon's point of union, the waist where there was a single target. Geryon tried to crush Heracles with his 3 heads. Heracles slipped between the giant's legs and aimed at the waist that joined Geryon's 3 bodies. Heracles drew his bow. This time, he fired not just 1 arrow, but 3 poisoned arrows simultaneously. The arrows were coated with the Hydra's deadliest venom. Hiss! 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 The three arrows simultaneously struck Geryon's point of union. The poison instantly began to spread through the three bodies. Geryon let out a terrifying triple-layered shriek. His three bodies began to convulse simultaneously. Geryon dropped his 6 spears and 6 shields. He possessed the strength of the Titans, but he could not resist the venom of the Hydra. Geryon collapsed lifelessly onto the red earth of Erythea with all 3 of his bodies. Heracles had completed the most difficult part of the task, defeating the most fantastic monster of the world. Heracles began driving the herd of cattle past the corpses of Orthus and Eurytion toward the shore of the ocean. The red cattle were wild and uncontrolled, even without their herdsmen. Heracles could not load the cattle back into the Golden Cup. He had to drive them toward the shores of the Iberian Peninsula, Spain. Heracles, along with the herd, began wading through the shallow waters of the ocean. Helios's Golden Cup returned to take Heracles back, carrying him toward the east. This would be the most difficult and longest journey of Heracles' 12 labors. Heracles had to drive the herd from the Iberian Peninsula, across the Pyrenees and the Alps, along the southern coasts of Europe, toward Italy. During the journey, Heracles faced countless difficulties to protect his cattle. The cattle were constantly attempted to be stolen by common thieves and local tribes, and Heracles had to fight every time to retrieve them. In Italy, a massive, fire-breathing monster named Cacus stole the best of the cattle while Heracles slept. Cacus dragged the cattle into his cave using reverse footprints. Heracles did not realize the trick until he heard the cattle lowing. Heracles tore open Cacus's cave with brute force and strangled the monster to death. When the cattle reached Sicily, Poseidon, instigated by Hera, sent a swarm of gadflies to drive the cattle mad. The cattle went wild and scattered in all directions. Heracles was forced to undertake a pursuit lasting months to gather them again. Throughout this long, difficult, and exhausting journey, Heracles had to preserve not only the cattle, but also his own patience and endurance. As the year passed, Heracles brought the cattle closer to Mycenae. Finally, at the end of a year, Heracles arrived at Mycenae with Geryon's red cattle. The cattle had come from the farthest corner of the world and survived countless dangers on the journey. Heracles drove the herd to the square of Mycenae before Eurystheus's walls. King Eurystheus experienced a terrible shock when he saw this sight. Heracles had returned from the end of the world, defeated the three-bodied giant, and brought thousands of cattle across the entirety of Europe. The king knew he could no longer defeat Heracles. Eurystheus was forced to accept this labor as well and took the cattle. He sacrificed Geryon's cattle to Hera. The 10th trial was complete. Heracles had not only defeated a monster, but had also crossed the known boundaries of the world. Since Eurystheus had not counted 2 of the labors, the Hydra and Augeas, Heracles had 2 labors remaining. The king decided to send Heracles on the most mysterious and difficult task yet. This task would force Heracles to take a great step on the road to immortality. The 11th labor, the golden apples of the Hesperides. Heracles had to reach the most secret garden of the world, the source of the god's nectar, confront Atlas himself, and steal the golden apples. This would be Heracles' greatest test of both intellect and strength. The fruit of immortality is gathered not merely by strength, but by wisdom, for the grace of the gods scorns brute force. 10 labors had dragged Heracles across the world, through paths of sorrow and triumph. He had learned to use brute strength, wit, and divine aid. Now King Eurystheus commanded Heracles the greatest impossibility, to steal the secret of immortality. The herald Copreus, this time, spoke neither of a monster's savagery nor a king's barbarity. He spoke directly of the sanctity of Olympus. His voice was not timid as in previous tasks, but filled with a respectful dread. When Copreus announced the 11th labor, he stated that Eurystheus had commanded Heracles to bring the golden apples, the gift of Gaia, Mother Earth, protected by the Hesperides. He added that these apples were the wedding gift of Zeus and Hera, the source of the gods' nectar. Heracles was required to steal them, overcome the 100-headed dragon Ladon, and deliver them to Mycenae. Copreus proclaimed that this task would be Heracles' greatest trial on his path to immortality. This quest was, mythologically, Heracles' most difficult. To steal the golden apples was not just a theft, but a challenge to the order of the gods. The apples were located in the most secret and furthest place in the known world, in a garden beyond the ocean, near the shoulders of Atlas. Eurystheus's plan was simple. It was impossible to find the location of this garden. Even if he found the garden, Heracles would have to defeat the Hesperides, nymphs of the evening, who guarded the apples, and the sleepless, 100-headed, 1,000-voiced dragon Ladon. Most importantly, Heracles was forced to travel to the place where the sun sets in this task. This was the very end of the world. This time, Heracles did not even know where to direct his brute force. The location of the apples was a secret known only to Olympus and the very ancient gods. This quest had to begin with a search for knowledge, which was only possible through the task of finding the way and capturing Nereus, the old man of the sea. Heracles began his journey, turning back from the path where he had driven Geryon's cattle and moved toward the shores of Libya. He had to consult with the oldest and most reliable source of wisdom, Nereus, son of the sea god Pontus. Nereus was a mysterious being, constantly changing shape, and only revealing his prophecies when captured and forced. With information received from a nymph, Heracles learned that Nereus slept in a coastal cave, having emerged from the depths of the ocean. Heracles entered the cave and leaped onto the sleeping Nereus, grasping his body with titanic strength. Nereus immediately began to change shape to escape Heracles' hands. He first transformed into a cold, slippery, scaled sea serpent, then into a fire whose flames scorched even Heracles' Nemean Lion hide, and finally into a stream of water that left Heracles holding only wet soil. But Heracles was as stubborn and persistent as when he strangled the Nemean Lion. He continued to hold Nereus through every form with the strength of his muscles and will. He let go neither of the fire nor the water. Finally, Nereus surrendered to Heracles' unwavering determination and returned to his own old man form. His voice was tired and raspy, and he roared for Heracles to release him, stating that he was the son of Zeus, and in return he would reveal where to find the golden apples. Heracles released Nereus's wrists. Nereus told Heracles that the garden of the Hesperides was at the world's western edge, near the shoulders of Atlas, but issued an important warning. He cautioned Heracles not to pick the apples with his own hands, stating that this was not his destiny, and that he would need an intermediary. This wisdom was carved into Heracles' mind. He realized that brute force would not be enough, and an agent was necessary. Armed with the knowledge from Nereus, Heracles continued his journey, undertaking side quests throughout Africa, filled with cruelty and salvation. This was not a direct route to the garden. As Heracles moved westward, he had to confront injustice. The wrestling match with Antaeus occurred in Libya. Antaeus, a colossal wrestler, son of Poseidon and Gaia, killed all strangers after defeating them in wrestling. Antaeus challenged Heracles, and Heracles quickly realized the source of Antaeus' strength. Antaeus was invincible and tireless as long as his foot touched the ground, drawing power from his mother Gaia. Heracles used his intellect rather than wrestling with brute force. With his enormous power, he lifted Antaeus into the air. When Antaeus was cut off from his mother's strength, he instantly weakened, and Heracles choked him to death in the air with a titanic embrace. This was proof that Heracles had once again used strategy to defeat a monster. Continuing his journey, the incident of the sacrifices of Busiris occurred in Egypt. There, the cruel King Busiris was acting on the command of a prophet who had told him he must sacrifice foreigners to Zeus to end famine and plague. Heracles was captured as soon as he set foot on Egyptian soil and taken to the altar for sacrifice. Enraged by this injustice, Heracles shattered his chains as he was being brought to the altar and attacked the guards. The battle began in the sands of Egypt. Heracles killed not only the guards but also King Busiris and his son Amphidamas, slaying them on their own altar like sacrificial animals. This was a demonstration of Heracles' stand against tyranny, applying the wrath of the gods with his own hand. Heracles continued to move westward, reaching the Caucasus Mountains, where the most tragic figure of the Titans, Prometheus, was chained, and his task there was the breaking of Prometheus's chains. Prometheus had been condemned by Zeus to eternal torment for stealing fire for humanity. Every day a giant eagle would come and eat his liver, which would grow back the next day. When Heracles saw this sight, his heart ached. He felt that Prometheus was a friend of humanity and that this cruelty must end. He also knew that Prometheus possessed divine wisdom and that this knowledge could aid him in the quest for the golden apples. Heracles drew his bow and fired an arrow, poisoned with the venom of the Hydra, toward the eagle. The arrow did not miss its target, and the eagle, with a cry of sudden agony, fell onto the cliffs of the Caucasus and perished. Heracles walked to Prometheus and shattered the colossal chains with his brute force. After years of torment, Prometheus was finally free. He looked at Heracles with gratitude and repeated and detailed the advice Nereus had given for the quest. Prometheus told Heracles that the garden of the Hesperides was protected by Ladon and the nymphs, and cautioned him that while he must defeat Ladon, he must not pick the apples with his own hands. He explained that when he approached the garden beyond the ocean, he would find Atlas, who bore the sky on his shoulders, and only Atlas could safely retrieve the apples for him, as he was the Hesperides' father and close to them. He advised Heracles to make an offer to Atlas and use his cunning. Prometheus also added that Zeus would overlook this event, as it was part of fate. Equipped with Prometheus's wisdom, Heracles advanced to the final stage of his journey toward the westernmost edge of the world. Heracles finally reached the edge of the world, the place where Atlas's shoulders lay. This was the end of the world, the garden of Atlas and Ladon. This location offered a fantastic spectacle. The sky here was like a blue and silver canopy. The ground was the edge of a precipice. The sight he beheld was beyond imagination. The Titan Atlas bore the weight of the sky on his colossal shoulders. Atlas's muscles looked petrified from time and burden. His face held the expression of eternal suffering. Directly nearby was the Garden of the Hesperides, glowing with a golden yellow light. In the center of the garden stood a magnificent tree, its leaves gold, its branches silver, and its fruits bright gold, the gift of Gaia, Mother Earth, bearing the golden apples. At the foot of this tree slept Ladon, the garden's tireless guardian. Ladon's 100 heads looked in different directions, each head emitting a different sound, and Ladon was a perpetually watchful guardian whom even the Hesperides themselves could not lull to sleep. Heracles first had to overcome Ladon. Prometheus's warning and cunning came into play here. Heracles did not approach the garden. He hid in the shadow of the Nemean Lion hide and fired an arrow, poisoned with the venom of the Hydra, from afar. The arrow struck one of Ladon's 100 heads. The poison instantly spread through Ladon's gigantic body. Ladon let out a terrifying, synchronized shriek from all 100 heads at once. The roar of the 100 heads caused even the sky to tremble. With a final struggle, Ladon tore up the ground around the garden and collapsed lifelessly. His 100 heads were silenced forever. Ladon's death and shriek drew the attention of even the Titan Atlas. Atlas could not turn his head but looked at Heracles with his eyes. Heracles approached, transitioning into the bargain with Atlas, the Titan's burden phase, and told him he had killed Ladon. Heracles addressed the mighty Atlas, stating that he was the son of Zeus and begged him to bring him 3 of the golden apples of the Hesperides, so he could complete his atonement. Atlas looked at Heracles. A glimmer of hope appeared on his face against Heracles' power and boldness. Atlas saw Heracles' offer as an opportunity to be rid of his eternal burden. Atlas's voice was deep and thunderous, as if the earth itself were speaking, and he said that he was the father of the Hesperides, and only he could retrieve the apples. However, stating that his hands were full, he proposed that if Heracles took his place and bore the weight of the sky on his shoulders, he would go and retrieve those apples for him. This was Heracles' greatest test of intellect. He remembered the warnings of Nereus and Prometheus: do not pick the apples with your own hand. Heracles accepted the offer. With an endless force of will, he stepped directly beneath Atlas's shoulders. Atlas slowly and carefully transferred the weight of the sky onto Heracles' massively muscled shoulders. When Heracles felt this burden, he was stunned. This was not the weight of a mountain. This was the weight of eternity, time, and the entire universe. Heracles' muscles immediately contracted and trembled. He was pushed to the absolute limit of his strength. His shoulders were crushed beneath the cold, petrified skin of the sky. Atlas, with a momentary sense of relief and joy, walked quickly toward the Garden of the Hesperides, entering the stage of the retrieval of the golden apples and the Titan's betrayal. Atlas went to his daughters, the Hesperides, Aegle, Erytheia, and Hesperorethus. They rejoiced upon seeing their father. Atlas told them that Ladon was dead and that Heracles was holding the sky. The Hesperides, in sorrow and astonishment, bowed to their father. Atlas personally gathered 3 of the golden apples. Atlas returned to Heracles with the apples. A look of crude triumph was on his face. He was free of the burden he had carried for thousands of years and decided to leave that weight upon the shoulders of a powerful hero like Heracles. Atlas approached Heracles and told him he had brought the golden apples, but declared that he no longer wished to carry this burden, and that Heracles would continue holding the sky while he personally took the apples to Eurystheus. This was the Titan's cruel betrayal. Crushed beneath the weight of the world, Heracles could not oppose Atlas. He was literally helpless. In the face of the Titan's betrayal, Heracles cast aside his anger and fear and enacted Heracles' cunning, the return of the burden maneuver. He had to use the sharpest corner of his mind. This was not a battle, but a psychological duel. Heracles spoke slowly, his voice barely audible, as the weight of the sky was constricting his throat. Heracles told the mighty Atlas that he was eternally grateful for bearing the burden for him and retrieving the apples, adding that it was easy for Atlas, a Titan, to carry this burden, but that he was only a mortal and the weight was crushing his shoulders. Atlas looked at Heracles with a mocking smile. Heracles asked Atlas for one more favor, to hold the load for just a moment until he could fashion a cushion so it would not slip from his shoulders, asking permission to place his hide beneath them, after which Atlas could take the apples to Eurystheus. He asserted that this was just a minute's work. When Atlas heard Heracles' simple and seemingly reasonable request, he fell victim to his pride and arrogance. He did not perceive Heracles as cunning enough to trick a Titan. Atlas put the golden apples on the ground and slowly reached out to Heracles' shoulders. He took the weight of the sky back onto his own shoulders, back to his eternal burden. That was the moment. The instant he was free of the weight on his shoulders, Heracles moved with the speed of 1,000th of a second. He abandoned the pretense of adjusting the hide and grabbed the golden apples he had placed on the ground. Roaring with a laugh and a powerful voice, Heracles shouted, "Pleasant journeys, mighty Atlas. Eurystheus is not my slave nor your servant." Heracles did not wait for a second. Holding the golden apples in his hand, he left the Titan Atlas, tricked and furious, alone beneath the endless weight of the sky. Holding the golden apples, Heracles began the final return to Mycenae, the fruit of immortality. He journeyed from the westernmost edge of the world toward Mycenae. These apples were no ordinary fruits. They carried the scent of eternal life. When Heracles' hand touched them, it was as if all the wounds and weariness in his body were momentarily healed. During his journey, Heracles gave the golden apples to no one and did not eat from them. He was tested in this task by his loyalty and honor. When he arrived in Mycenae, King Eurystheus was terribly shocked by the sight. Eurystheus was on the verge of losing his mind when he saw Heracles bringing the fruit of immortality. Heracles delivered the golden apples to Eurystheus and informed his king that the 11th labor was complete. Eurystheus was afraid to take the apples. He knew these apples belonged to the gods, and possessing them could attract the wrath of the gods. In desperation, Eurystheus ordered Heracles to immediately remove these apples from Mycenae, saying they could not belong to his kingdom, and to return them to Athena, who had sent him. Heracles took the apples and delivered them to Athena. Athena received the apples and returned them to the garden of the Hesperides. The golden apples had returned to their rightful place, the source of the gods' nectar. This was part of Heracles' curse. He could obtain immortality, but he could not possess it until his atonement was finished. The 11th trial was complete. Heracles had not only defeated Ladon, but had also proven himself cunning enough to trick even the Titan Atlas. Eurystheus knew that only one task remained before Heracles. The king would now confront Heracles with his greatest fear. This task would require Heracles to face death itself, the 12th and final labor, the bringing of Cerberus from the Underworld. Heracles would descend from the world of the living to the world of the dead, overcome Hades' three-headed hellhound, and bring him to Mycenae to the presence of the king. This would be the final trial that would seal Heracles' destiny. The cycle of fate was only complete when death itself was challenged, for one who returned from the underworld's threshold would break the chains of mortality and embrace eternity. 11 epic trials had proven not only the might of Heracles' muscles, but also the resilience of his spirit, the depth of his patience, and the sharpness of his cunning. King Eurystheus finally realized that neither beastly strength nor battlefield prowess could defeat this demigod hero. Therefore, for Heracles' final journey, he decided to send him to a realm that even the gods feared to tread, the eternal kingdom of the mighty Hades. When the herald Copreus appeared before Heracles this time, his voice was filled not with mere trembling fear, but with the shadow of absolute dread. He knew this task meant the hero's inevitable death. Swallowing hard, he announced the 12th and final labor, demanding that Heracles, by Eurystheus' command, capture the terrifying monster Cerberus, the guardian of the underworld's unyielding gate. He added that Heracles was to bring him back to the bright world of the living, chained and subdued, and emphasized that this was a place where no soul could enter and no living being could return without Hades' permission. Cerberus was the three-headed, merciless watchdog of death. This command bore a different character from all of Heracles' past deeds. It was neither a common monster hunt nor a simple attempt to steal a sacred object. This was a direct, audacious trespass into the sacred domain of death, a defiance of the cosmic order. Cerberus, the chilling offspring of the dreadful Typhon and the half-woman, half-serpent Echidna, was a colossal dog beast with 3 distinct heads, a venomous serpentine tail, razor-sharp bronze claws, and a mane of poisonous snakes. He not only prevented the escape of the dead souls, shades, but also guarded against the intrusion of the living. Eurystheus' final plan was clear. Heracles would either perish at the impassable boundaries of the underworld, die from Cerberus' poisonous bites, or most importantly, incur the terrible wrath of Hades, the god of the kingdom. Understanding that this endeavor could not be accomplished by brute force, the Nemean Lion skin, or his club alone, Heracles first sought a sacred and mystical preparation, realizing that entering the underworld required purification from the contamination carried by a mortal body. The hero traveled to the holy city of Eleusis to request initiation into the Eleusinian mysteries from the grand priest Eumolpus, the representative of Demeter, the goddess of the harvest. These mysteries were only open to the purified and those seeking to grasp the deep secrets of the cycle of life and death. Consequently, his hands, which had accidentally killed his friend the centaur Pholos, had to be cleansed of the bloodstain first. After completing the long and arduous purification rituals, Heracles was admitted to the mystic mysteries. This experience marked the greatest spiritual and intellectual transformation on the hero's path to atonement. He learned the unshakable laws of the underworld, the secrets of death and eternal rebirth, which would grant him not only physical, but also moral and spiritual superiority when defeating Cerberus and standing before the powerful presence of Lord Hades. Now spiritually purified and armed with the knowledge of the mysteries, Heracles began his descent into the land of the dead, heading for a deep cavern at Tyneron, a dark fissure shrouded in fear and eternal mist that separated the bright world of the living from the somber realm of the dead. Heracles advanced alone into the infinite silence of the dead. His steps echoed on the endless stone stairs. The atmosphere grew increasingly cold and damp, filling the air with the sharp scent of sulfur and eternal sorrow. In the underworld, unlike the unfortunate heroes who preceded him, Theseus, Orpheus, Heracles moved with the indirect favor granted by the gods because he had been initiated into the secrets of Demeter, Persephone's mother. This provided him with a measure of invulnerability even in the depths of Hades' kingdom. As he descended further, the hero encountered the shades, souls of the dead, who, terrified by the bright earthly presence of a living body, scattered around in whispers. However, the first and most critical obstacle in the underworld was the cursed Acheron River. On the bank of this river, which only allowed passage to the shades of the dead, stood Charon, the ancient and terrifying ferryman. When Charon saw Heracles, he recoiled in horror and absolutely refused to carry him, stating that his duty was to ferry the newly arrived dead to the eternal kingdom, not the living. Heracles was forced to resolve this rule-bound obstacle with brute force, roaring at the old ferryman in anger that he must either carry him or he would smash his wretched boat, for this journey had been commanded by the high gods. Charon trembled under the weight of Heracles' titanic rage and power, reluctantly yielded, and carried the hero across the dark waters of the river. It is said that Charon was later chained and punished for a year for this act of disobedience. Beyond the Acheron, as Heracles journeyed deeper into the underworld, he saw the souls suffering the gods' punishments. One of these was the shade of Theseus, Heracles' friend and rival. When Theseus saw Heracles, he was filled with great hope. Knowing that Heracles' power and connection to the gods could save him, Heracles grabbed Theseus' spirit and pulled with colossal might to lift him from the chair of forgetfulness, and the chair's chains shattered before his strength. Theseus was free, but when Heracles attempted to rescue Pirithous as well, the underworld began to tremble, and Hades warned that he would not permit any more souls to be stolen. Heracles understood this warning and was forced to abandon Pirithous. This incident demonstrated both Heracles' compassion and his limitations. Though he could not save all souls, he succeeded in rescuing his friend. Advancing toward Hades' palace, the most dark, cold, and magnificent structure in the underworld, where Cerberus constantly barked, Heracles finally stood before the ebony and gold thrones of Hades, the god of the kingdom, and Queen Persephone. Hades was terrifying and majestic, like darkness itself. A glint of astonishment mingled with his hatred for the world of mortals shone in his eyes. Hades roared, accusing Heracles, the son of Zeus, of being more audacious than all mortals and gods, and demanding to know by what right he trespassed upon his kingdom. He warned that if his purpose was to steal souls, he would chain him forever in this eternal darkness. Heracles, in turn, bowed with deep respect, assuring the High Lord Hades that he was the servant of Eurystheus, and sought Cerberus, with his permission, to complete his atonement. He promised to show the beast to Eurystheus and immediately return it afterward, as this was his 12th and final labor. Hades smiled. It was a cold, bone-chilling, mocking smile, for he knew that capturing Cerberus was impossible for any mortal power. Hades told Heracles that he could take Cerberus only on the condition that he defeat him using only his own naked strength, without using a sword, arrow, the power of the Nemean Lion's skin, or the venom of the Hydra, and that he must conquer the beast without harming or injuring it. Heracles accepted this challenge, an ordeal that would strain even a Titan. With Hades' conditional permission, Heracles advanced toward the underworld entrance where Cerberus waited, ready for the ultimate test of strength. When the monster saw Heracles, it roared with savage fury and menace. The howls from its 3 throats made even the shades of the dead tremble. Small writhing, hissing snakes sprung from Cerberus's poisonous mane. Cerberus launched itself at Heracles, tensed like a steel spring. Heracles kept his promise to Hades, casting aside his skin and weapons. This was a contest of pure strength between a demigod hero and a cosmic beast. The hero cleverly evaded Cerberus's venomous bites, then flung his massive body onto the beast and grabbed the thick snake-skinned neck where the 3 heads converged with his steel-like arms. This was Heracles' final and most merciless physical trial. The monsters opposing might strained every single muscle in Heracles' body to its limit. The beast thrashed, groaned, and attempted to strike Heracles with its poisonous serpentine tail. Heracles mustered the raw, titanic force with which he had strangled the Nemean Lion and skillfully began to choke Cerberus's neck, just enough to render it unconscious but without breaking its bones. Cerberus stopped its terrifying howls. Its 3 heads struggled simultaneously and desperately for air, emitting choked gurgles. Heracles' arms were clamped around the beast's neck like an iron vise. Finally, Cerberus, overwhelmed by Heracles' unshakable pure power, relaxed, losing consciousness. The 3-headed dog hung limp and lifeless in Heracles' arms. Heracles had kept his word to Hades, conquering Cerberus with only his bare might, without shedding a single drop of blood. Heracles hoisted Cerberus's unconscious body onto his shoulders. This meant carrying the vanquished symbol of death toward the bright world of the living. The hero and his captive began climbing the endless stairs of the underworld. The shades of the underworld scattered in terror when they saw a living hero escaping with the guardian of death as his captive. During the return to the surface, Cerberus began to regain consciousness, but could not endure the bright light of life, foaming venomously at the mouth as they emerged from the cavern. This poisonous saliva, wherever it hit the ground, immediately transformed into the cursed and toxic plant, aconite, wolfsbane. Heracles chained Cerberus with bronze chains and dragged him from the world of the living toward Eurystheus' palace. When Heracles finally brought Cerberus, the symbol of death, to the magnificent walls of Mycenae, King Eurystheus' fear pushed him past the limits of sanity. Upon seeing Cerberus's 3 roaring heads, poisonous mane, and lion claws, Eurystheus flinched in absolute hysteria. The moment he heard the monster's howl, he hid inside the secret bronze jar within his palace. From inside the jar, the king whispered his final command to Copreus in a trembling voice, declaring that the task was complete, demanding the beast be sent back immediately, and proclaiming that this monster could not belong to the world of the living. Heracles smiled in triumph. The 12 labors were finally finished. He had paid his atonement and was free forever from Eurystheus' bondage. Heracles returned Cerberus to Hades, the place where he belonged in the underworld. Hades honored Heracles for keeping his promise and showing respect for his kingdom. Heracles' curse had ended. The remainder of his life would be filled with greater heroism, wars, and service to the gods. And finally, at the end of his mortal life, he would be elevated to Mount Olympus, joining the ranks of the immortals. The 12 labors were a grueling journey that carried Heracles from mortality to godhood. He became the greatest hero of humanity, immortalized as Hercules, a star shining in the heavens. I hope this epic has been a beautiful story to close your day. I look forward to your thoughts and requests. Don't forget to follow my channel. Love.